Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. When I was a little girl, we lived in a two-story house that always felt wrong. I don't know how else to describe it. It wasn't a rundown house. It wasn't one of those old, abandoned-looking places people whisper about. From the outside, it looked like any normal home in our neighborhood. Same brick exterior, same trimmed lawn, same windows staring blankly out at the street. But something about it never sat right with me. I used to tell my parents that the house was haunted, but they never took me seriously. They'd just laugh it off, saying I had an overactive imagination or that I'd watched too many scary movies. But I knew better. Even as a child, I could feel it. It wasn't just fear, it was a gut feeling, an instinct, something that settled deep in my bones and made me uncomfortable in my own home. At night, the house became something else entirely. Our street had working streetlights, but for some reason, their glow never touched our house. It was like a bubble of darkness surrounded it, pushing the light away. Inside, it was worse. Even when every light in the house was off, most homes still have that faint glow of the streetlights seeping in through the blinds, bouncing off walls. But not ours. Once the sun went down, the house was swallowed in pitch-black darkness, and no matter how many times I blinked, my eyes never adjusted. There were little things, too, things I tried to ignore at first. The sound of dripping water from the kitchen sink, even after my parents had it fixed multiple times. The feeling of being watched when I was alone. The way I'd sometimes catch a shadow in the corner of my eye, only for it to disappear the moment I turned my head. But the footsteps were the worst. My bedroom was at the top of the stairs, directly across from the hallway that led to my older sister's room. Some nights, I'd be lying in bed, half asleep, when I'd hear them. Soft at first, the slow creak of a step, then another, and another, coming up the stairs. My breath would catch in my throat, my whole body going stiff under the blankets. I'd listen, heart pounding, as the steps reached the landing. They never rushed. They never ran. It was always that same, steady rhythm, one step at a time, and then they'd start moving toward me. I'd stare at my bedroom door, willing it to stay closed. Sometimes, I thought I saw the handle twitch, like someone was trying to turn it. Other times, the footsteps would stop just outside my door, as if whoever, or whatever, it was standing there, waiting. I never screamed, never got up to check. I'd just squeeze my eyes shut, pull the blanket up to my chin, and stay as still as possible, hoping that whatever was out there would lose interest. I don't know how long this went on. Maybe weeks, maybe months. But the longer we lived in that house, the worse it got. One afternoon, when I was about 8 or 9, I stayed home from school because I was sick. My mom was home with me, and we spent most of the day in the upstairs living room, watching TV. It was comforting, having her there. With the sun shining through the windows and the sound of the television filling the space, the house almost felt normal. At some point, my mom asked me to go downstairs to turn off the AC. I didn't think twice about it. I got up, padded down the stairs in my socks, and reached the landing where the staircase turned. From there, I could look out over the railing and see most of the lower floor, the living room, the kitchen, and the hallway leading to my parents' bedroom. I don't know why I looked. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was that gut feeling again. Either way, as I reached the stoop and glanced over the railing, my eyes landed on my parents' bedroom door. It was cracked open, just slightly. And then, as if something on the other side had been waiting for me to look, the door swung open. It didn't creak. It didn't slowly drift like doors sometimes do when there's a draft. It opened in one smooth motion, wide enough that I could see straight into the darkened room. There was nothing there. No one. It was just me and my mom in the house. I froze. My stomach dropped, my breath catching in my throat. My skin broke out in goosebumps, so fast it felt like I'd stepped into an ice bath. And then panic took over. I turned and bolted back up the stairs, skipping steps, practically tripping over my own feet in my rush to get away. I burst into the living room, heart hammering, gasping for breath as I blurted out what I'd just seen. But my mom just shook her head and laughed. "You're seeing things," she said. I wasn't. I knew I wasn't. But no matter how much I insisted, she refused to believe me. I didn't go back downstairs for the rest of the day. The next incident was worse. My dad worked early morning shifts, meaning he had to leave the house at around 3 a.m. I always knew when he left because our security alarm would make a faint beeping sound when he opened the front door. It was a small comfort, in a way. I liked knowing exactly when I was alone upstairs with just my mom and sister. One night, after hearing the beep, I rolled over and went back to sleep. I don't know how much time passed before I felt it. A cold, wet kiss, right on my cheek. My eyes shot open. My skin was damp where the kiss had been. I lay there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I stayed that way until morning, too afraid to move. At breakfast, I asked my mom if she had come upstairs to check on me. She frowned and shook her head. I waited until my dad got home from work and asked if he had kissed me before he left. He looked confused. "No," he said. "So then, who kissed me?" I never got an answer. The worst night of my life happened when I was about 5. It was a stormy night. I remember the wind howling against the house, the rain hammering the windows. Every time lightning struck, the whole house would light up for a second before plunging back into darkness. I had a small nightlight in my room, but I didn't feel safe. So I grabbed it and went to my older sister's room down the hall. She was asleep, so I plugged my nightlight into the wall, climbed into her bed, and faced the open door. The hallway beyond was completely black. I pulled the covers up over my head, but left a small gap, a tiny hole just big enough for me to peek through and breathe. At some point, I must have dozed off. Then came the thunder. A loud crack, like the sky was splitting in half. My eyes snapped open, and I saw it. A face. Right there, inches from the hole in my blanket. Pale. Colorless. Empty. One piercing blue eye, locked onto mine. I couldn't move. Couldn't scream. We just stared at each other. Seconds passed. Then slowly, the face rose. I saw its transparent shape get up, turn, and drift into the pitch-black hallway. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I never told my parents. Years later, when we moved out, I finally decided to look up the history of the house. I wasn't expecting to find anything, but I did. An elderly woman had died there. In my room. I showed my parents the article, the records, everything. For the first time, they believed me. I wasn't crazy. I never was. That house was never just a house. I signed up for every camping trip I could during college. If the campus outdoor program had a trip and I had the money, I was on it. Sometimes, even when I didn't have the money or signed up late, they let me go anyway. By then, they knew me. I had a reputation, Eagle Scout, familiar with most of the common camping areas in the state, reliable. The trip leaders liked having someone they didn't need to babysit. This trip was supposed to be different. Not just a regular backpacking weekend, or some basic intro to the outdoors thing. We were tagging along with an archaeologist at a dig site, helping out with some of the grunt work, while she pieced together the history of an extinct group of Native Americans. From what she had found so far, it looked like they had spent about a year in this spot before moving on. No written records, of course, just broken pottery, mud tobacco pipes, fire pits, and the faint outlines of old huts. It was fascinating, standing there looking at the bare patches of earth, knowing that hundreds of years ago, people had lived here, cooked here, raised their families here. It was late fall, which meant cool days and colder nights, but I didn't mind. Most of the group stayed in a trailer the archaeologist had set up near the site, but I preferred sleeping outside. So did another guy on the trip, and the trip leader, so we set up 2 tents a few dozen feet from the trailer. The trip leader had his own tent, and I shared mine with the other guy. I didn't know him well, just that he was another student who liked camping and didn't mind roughing it. The first couple of days were fine. We spent daylight hours at the dig site, helping sift through dirt, carefully scraping layers away to expose whatever had been buried for centuries. In the evenings, we sat around the fire, eating whatever quick meal we'd put together, listening to the archaeologist talk about what she was finding. At night, the wind blew cold through the trees, and the darkness stretched thick and heavy over the clearing. I always sleep well outdoors, but that last night was different. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding for no reason I could name. That strange, disoriented feeling settled over me. The one where you have no idea how long you've been asleep or why you're even awake. My breath felt loud in my ears. The tent was still and silent except for the slow, steady breathing of my tent mate. Then something moved against the fabric of the tent. It wasn't wind. I knew what wind against a tent sounded like, the shifting pressure, the way it rattled and pulled. This was different. It was deliberate. A slow, steady brush against the lower part of the tent, near my feet. I stayed still, my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to process what it could be. A raccoon? A stray dog? The archaeologist had mentioned that coyotes moved through the area sometimes, but they usually stayed clear of people. Then something sniffed, right next to my head. It was so close I could hear the wet inhale of breath, the way it pulled in the scent of the tent, of me. My stomach clenched. It moved, the sniffing sound shifting downward, following the curve of the tent. It was big, whatever it was. Bigger than a raccoon, bigger than a stray dog. My skin crawled. I turned my head slightly, as slowly as I could, and met the wide eyes of my tent mate. He was frozen, just like me. I could see the faint outline of his face in the dark, his breathing shallow. He had heard it too. The thing outside didn't leave. It lingered, brushing against the tent again, moving in slow, lazy circles. I could hear the light patter of paws or feet on the packed dirt outside. I swallowed, trying to force my thoughts to stay logical. Maybe it was just curious. Maybe it smelled the food on our breath, the faint scent of the fire still clinging to our clothes. Then another sound. A second set of steps. Another sniff, this time near my tent mate's side of the tent. There was more than one. I lay there, every muscle locked in place, listening as they prowled around. Never in a hurry, never rushing, just moving, sniffing, brushing up against the thin layer of nylon that separated us. My mind kept flashing back to the dig site, to the old fire pits, the abandoned traces of people who had once lived here. Had they dealt with this too? Had they lain awake at night, listening to the sounds of something moving just beyond the safety of their shelters? Time stretched. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. Maybe more. I lost track. The sniffing never stopped entirely, just came and went, moving from one side of the tent to the other. I didn't move. I didn't even let myself shift to a more comfortable position. My tent mate didn't either. Eventually, finally, the sounds faded. The soft patter of movement grew more distant. The brush of fur or skin, or whatever it was, stopped. The sniffing sound disappeared into the night. I didn't fall back asleep. Neither did my tent mate. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the tent fabric, I finally moved, my muscles stiff and aching. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped outside. The air was cold, the sky still streaked with the last hints of night. Then I saw the tracks. Dozens of them. They circled our tent, the trip leader's tent, the trailer where the others slept. Some were pressed deep into the dirt, others faint and overlapping, like they had lingered, pacing, watching. My stomach turned. I walked over to the trip leader's tent and saw the same thing. Tracks everywhere, pressed right up against the fabric, as if whatever had been there had leaned close, listening. The archaeologist was the first one out of the trailer. She saw me standing there, looking at the tracks, and frowned. "What is it?" I pointed. She followed my gaze, stepping closer, studying the tracks. Her expression shifted, recognition settling in. "Coyotes," she said after a moment. "They come through here regularly." I stared at the tracks, my mind replaying the sounds from the night before. I had heard coyotes before, distant yips, the occasional howl in the night. I had even seen them, darting along tree lines or scavenging near campgrounds. But I had never known them to behave like that. The trip leader came out a few minutes later. He didn't believe me at first, thought I was messing with him, until I showed him the tracks. Even then, he shrugged it off. "They were probably just looking for food," he said. "Not a big deal." I didn't argue. We packed up that morning and headed back to campus. The others joked and talked like it was just another trip, just another weekend outdoors. I didn't say much. My tent mate didn't either. I kept thinking about the way they had moved, the way they had sniffed, lingered. How long had they been there before I woke up? How close had they gotten before I realized what was happening? And if I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't lain there, frozen silent, what would they have done? I still don't know. I was 13 this summer. I spent 3 nights at my friend Daniel's house. 3 long, unsettling nights that made me realize some places carry things you can't explain. Daniel lived in one of the oldest houses in our neighborhood, a tall, narrow thing with steep gables and dark wooden siding that made it look like it had been lifted straight from some forgotten century. The house sat near the end of Norwood Street, just before the woods swallowed up the last few lots. It was the kind of house that always seemed cold, even in the dead heat of summer, and had a certain heaviness to it, like the walls had absorbed every conversation, every argument, every moment of sadness or joy that had ever happened inside. My parents never liked me going there. They weren't the type to believe in ghosts or curses, but they'd always had a bad feeling about that place, even before Daniel's family moved in. It wasn't something they ever explained outright, just small, offhand comments, an unease that never had any real explanation. Maybe it was the house's history. Maybe it was just a feeling. Either way, they never let me stay over. But that summer, things were different. My parents were going out of town for a few days, and my older brother, Jake, who was 17, was in charge of me and my younger brother, Noah, who was 8. With no parents around to say otherwise, Jake decided it wouldn't hurt for us to stay over at Daniel's. It made it easier for him to keep an eye on us, and with Daniel's family being so easygoing, there'd be no rules, no structure. Just 3 days of hanging out, playing games, and eating junk food. The first day was perfect. We spent hours in the backyard, running through the sprinkler, throwing a football until the sun started to dip behind the trees. Daniel's parents made burgers and fries, and we ate outside at the rickety wooden table under a string of old patio lights that flickered every so often. When night came, we dragged blankets and pillows into the living room and built a massive fort, taking turns sneaking into the kitchen to steal soda and whatever snacks we could find. The house, with all its quirks and old wood creaking under every step, felt cozy, like it was just another normal house. The second day was when things started to feel different. It started small, things that, on their own, wouldn't have meant much. The air inside the house felt heavy, like a storm was about to roll in, even though the sky outside was clear. There was a draft in the upstairs hallway, but no windows were open. I kept hearing little sounds, small, almost imperceptible things, like the shuffle of feet on old wood or the soft click of a door latch. Every time I turned, there was nothing. That night, Daniel mentioned the Ouija board. We'd spent the whole evening swapping scary stories, exaggerating details, and trying to spook each other in the dim glow of the flashlight we had set in the middle of the room. Eventually, the stories felt repetitive, the fear forced. That's when Daniel sat up suddenly, a grin creeping across his face. We should use the Ouija board. I wasn't excited about the idea. Not because I believed in ghosts, but because it felt wrong. Like bringing it out would change something. But no one wanted to be the one to back down, so we all followed Daniel upstairs to the attic. The attic was cramped, the air stale and thick with the scent of dust and old wood. The only light came from a single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows along the slanted walls. The Ouija board was tucked in the corner, covered in dust, its edges worn from years of being handled. We sat in a tight circle, fingers lightly resting on the planchette. "Are there any ghosts here?" Daniel asked. The planchette barely moved before settling on no. "Can you prove there are no ghosts here?" A pause. Then it slid to yes. It wasn't creepy exactly, just strange. The responses felt deliberate, like something was humoring us. After a few more questions that led nowhere, we lost interest. The fear that had crept into the attic faded, replaced with the kind of exhausted indifference that came from being up too late. We put the board away, trudged back downstairs, and fell asleep in the living room fort. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The house was silent, the kind of deep, all-consuming silence that only exists in old places late at night. But then I heard it, a sound so soft it almost didn't register. A shuffle, like bare feet moving over wood. I lifted my head, heart hammering, and saw it. A woman, tall and thin, almost unnaturally so, standing at the edge of the room near Jake's bed. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She was facing him, her posture unnervingly rigid. The shadows made it hard to see her face, but I could make out the hollow contours of her cheeks, the long, limp hair that hung past her shoulders. I told myself I was dreaming, that I was still half asleep, seeing things that weren't there. But then I glanced toward the opposite bed and met Daniel's brother's eyes. Wide, terrified, locked on the same figure. We had both seen her. Then, as if on cue, she turned and left the room. Jake stirred, sat up slowly. But it wasn't normal. His movements were sluggish, unnatural, like he was still asleep but walking anyway. He got up and followed her. I whispered his name. Nothing. Panic shot through me. I scrambled to my feet, Daniel's brother right behind me, and we bolted into the hallway. Jake was already gone. We sprinted upstairs, the attic door slightly ajar. Inside, in the dark, stood Jake, barefoot, confused, like he'd just woken up and had no idea how he got there. And then the screaming started. Daniel, from the room we had just left. We ran back downstairs. The lights were on now, his parents beside his bed, his face pale and shaken. They said it was fine, that it was okay, but I saw the way his mother's hands trembled when she smoothed his hair. The way his father checked the locks twice before turning off the lights. The next morning, we left. Jake didn't remember a thing. Not the woman, not leaving the room, not standing in the attic. I didn't sleep for the rest of the trip. We never stayed at Daniel's house again. Years later, I finally asked my parents why they hated that place so much. They never gave me a straight answer, just vague mentions of things they had heard. That a woman had lived there once, alone, well into old age. That after she passed, the house sat empty for years because no one wanted it. That the families who moved in never stayed long. I don't know what I saw that night, but I do know one thing. Some places are just wrong. I grew up in the woods. Not in a house, not even in a cabin, but in a tent. My parents had an old camp trailer, but that was theirs. My brother and I lived separately in what we called the cave. It wasn't a real cave, just the camper shell from my father's pickup, placed over a hole dug into the side of the mountain. The walls were packed dirt, the ground uneven and always dusty. At night, the air inside felt damp, and the smell of earth clung to everything. This was normal for us. We had no electricity. We cooked over an open fire or on the gas stove inside the trailer. Our water came from a stream that ran through the trees about 100 yards from camp. My parents didn't think it was strange to live this way, and neither did we. When summer came, school didn't exist. There was just the forest, the river, and the mountains. Wild animals were part of daily life. We saw deer and elk often, their huge bodies moving like ghosts between the trees. Sometimes we spotted wolves. Once, we found bear tracks not far from our camp. We knew the rules. Don't leave food out. Don't run if you see a bear. Don't ever go anywhere alone after dark. It was just how things were. The nights were full of sounds. Crickets, owls, the rustling of small animals moving through dry leaves. Sometimes, we'd wake up to coyotes howling in the distance, their voices rising and falling like something sad and desperate. Other times, something larger moved through the trees, slow, deliberate steps that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But nothing had ever truly frightened me before. Not until the screaming started. It came on the first night, late, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the only light came from the stars. I woke up with a strange feeling in my stomach, that kind of half-conscious awareness that something wasn't right. The air inside the cave was still. My brother lay curled up in his sleeping bag beside me, his breathing slow and deep. I was about to close my eyes again when the sound ripped through the silence. A scream. Not a person, not an animal I recognized, something else. It started low, almost like a baby crying, then rose higher and higher, stretching out into a terrible, thin wail. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My whole body went stiff. The scream didn't stop. It went on for several seconds, then faded, only to start again, closer this time. My chest tightened. It felt like the sound was inside me, vibrating in my bones. I wanted to move, to wake my brother, but I couldn't. I just lay there, eyes wide open in the pitch-black darkness, listening. The scream came again, farther away now, fading into the night. I counted the seconds after it disappeared, my pulse pounding in my ears. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. In the morning, I told myself it had been a dream. But the next night, the screaming came again. This time, it started earlier, while the fire was still burning. My brother and I had been sitting outside, watching the flames flicker when the sound cut through the night. It came from deep in the woods, rising and falling in long, awful wails. My skin went cold. I could tell by the way my brother tensed beside me that he heard it too. We didn't move. We just listened, barely breathing, as the screaming echoed through the trees. It came in bursts, starting far away, then rushing closer until it seemed like it was circling the camp. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an animal either. It was something in between. The fire crackled. The night stretched out, and the screaming faded, moving off into the woods. My parents, inside their trailer, either didn't hear it or didn't care. My brother and I climbed into the cave, pulling our sleeping bags tight around us, listening to every little sound outside. Eventually, the night went silent again. But the next night, it came back. And the night after that. For 4 or 5 nights straight, the screaming returned. Always the same, starting in the distance, rising in volume, echoing from every direction at once. Then, just as suddenly, fading away into nothing. Each time, my fear grew worse. By the 4th night, I was barely sleeping at all. My whole body ached from lying tense and motionless in my sleeping bag, my ears straining for any sign of it. During the day, we tried to explain it. My father, when we mentioned it, just shrugged. Probably a cougar, he said. Or an elk. They make weird sounds sometimes. But he hadn't heard it. He didn't understand. We knew what a cougar sounded like. We knew what elk sounded like. This wasn't that. On the 5th night, I finally couldn't take it anymore. When the screaming started, I sat up, heart hammering, and crawled toward the opening of the cave. My brother stirred behind me, but didn't wake up. The night outside was empty, the fire reduced to barely glowing coals. I held my breath and listened. The scream came again. It was closer this time, maybe only a few hundred yards away. My hands clenched into fists. I wanted to see it. I needed to see it. I crawled out of the cave and stood up, my legs shaking beneath me. The forest stretched out in all directions, black and endless. The scream came again, and I swore I could feel it in the ground beneath my feet. I waited. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the screaming stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. I stood there, frozen, staring into the darkness, my ears ringing. Nothing moved. Then I heard the leaves rustle. Just once. Just enough to let me know that something was out there. Watching, I turned and bolted. I dove back into the cave, heart slamming against my ribs. My brother stirred, mumbling in his sleep, but I didn't wake him. I just lay there, staring into the darkness, waiting. But the screaming didn't come again. That was the last night we ever heard it. For weeks after, I listened, waiting for it to return. But whatever it was, it had moved on. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe it had been something else. I don't know. But even now, years later, I still think about it. That sound, that terrible, inhuman screaming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. And the way, on that last night, as I stood outside in the darkness, it had finally stopped, like it knew I was there. I've spent a lot of time in the woods, hunting, hiking, camping. Most of my free time has been out in the wild, away from noise, people, and the never-ending hum of civilization. I've always thought of the forest as a place of peace, where you could be alone with your thoughts, where nothing existed beyond the wind through the trees and the quiet rustling of animals moving through the undergrowth. I never thought it could be a place of fear, not in the way that people imagine when they tell campfire stories. But I learned the hard way that nature doesn't care about how experienced you think you are. It was supposed to be an easy solo camping trip. A few days in the backcountry of northern Idaho, deep in the Selway Bitterroot wilderness. I had planned everything down to the last detail. Gear packed carefully, route mapped out, weather checked. I wasn't worried. I'd done this kind of thing more times than I could count. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp, the sun warm but not too hot, and I made good progress on the trail. By late afternoon, I found a good clearing near a small stream, set up my tent, and started a fire. The woods were quiet except for the occasional bird song and the distant hoot of an owl as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was the kind of solitude I craved. That night, I slept like a rock. No strange noises, no eerie feelings, just the cool night air and the comforting weight of my sleeping bag. Everything was going exactly as planned. The second day, I decided to go off-trail. That was my first mistake. I had seen a ridge in the distance that looked like it might have a great view, and I figured I'd hike up, take a few pictures, and then loop back down to my campsite before dark. I wasn't worried. I had a map, a compass, and a GPS. I wasn't some weekend hiker with no idea how to navigate. The climb up was harder than I expected. The ridge was steeper than it had looked from below, and the underbrush was thick, full of hidden roots and loose rocks. More than once, I slipped and had to catch myself on tree branches, my heart pounding from the sudden drops. By the time I reached the top, I was sweating and breathing hard, but the view was worth it. The valley stretched out below, the trees rolling like waves in every direction. I stayed longer than I should have. By the time I started my descent, the light had changed. The sun was lower than I had realized, and the shadows had started to stretch long across the forest floor. I told myself I still had plenty of time, but in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that I had made a mistake. Then I lost the trail. I don't know when exactly it happened. One moment, I was following what I thought was my original path down, and the next, the trees all looked the same. I tried to backtrack, but nothing looked familiar. The landscape had shifted, the landmarks I thought I had memorized suddenly blending into a sea of identical pines and tangled underbrush. My GPS wasn't working. No signal. I pulled out my compass and map, trying to get my bearings, but my own confidence had turned against me. I had gone off trail too far, and now I wasn't sure which direction I had come from. The sun kept sinking lower. I told myself to stay calm. I had supplies. I wasn't in immediate danger. I could find my way back if I just focused. But then, the forest changed. The silence was the first thing I noticed. The birds had stopped singing. The wind had died down. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like the world itself was holding its breath. I strained my ears, listening for anything, a rustling branch, the distant sound of water, but there was nothing. Then the smell hit me. It was faint at first, just a whiff of something rotten carried on the still air. I ignored it, thinking maybe it was a dead animal somewhere nearby. But as I kept walking, it got stronger, thick, clinging to the back of my throat. I had smelled death before. I knew what it was. But this wasn't just one dead animal. It was something more. Then, I saw the first carcass. It was a deer, or what was left of one. The body was torn open, ribs exposed, the flesh blackened and swarming with flies. Something had killed it, but it wasn't the usual predator attack. The wounds weren't clean. They were jagged, almost like something had ripped into it with claws that didn't quite belong to a bear or a cougar. A few yards away, there was another. A smaller animal, maybe a fox, its body twisted unnaturally, limbs splayed out like it had been thrown. My stomach turned. I wasn't alone out here. I forced myself to move faster, trying to put as much distance between myself and whatever had killed those animals. But no matter which direction I went, the smell lingered. Then I heard it, a crunch of leaves. I froze. It wasn't the sound of a small animal. It was heavier, deliberate. Close. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the trees. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. I wasn't sure when I started running, but suddenly my breath was ragged, my heart hammering. The trees blurred past, my boots slipping on loose dirt as I stumbled blindly through the undergrowth. I wasn't thinking about my direction anymore. I just needed to get away. Something moved in my peripheral vision. A shadow, a flicker of movement between the trees. My instincts screamed at me to keep going. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would burst. When I finally stopped, gasping for air, I realized I had no idea where I was. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind. I forced myself to think. I needed to regain control. I needed to find high ground, get my bearings. I wasn't going to die out here. I climbed the nearest hill, my legs shaking with exhaustion. When I reached the top, I pulled out my map again, trying to match the landscape to what I had planned. It took time, but I finally spotted a ridgeline that I recognized. It was miles away, but it was something. I forced myself to move, slower now, careful. Whatever had been out there, I hadn't seen it. Maybe it was just my imagination, fear playing tricks on my mind. Or maybe it was still watching. I didn't stop walking until the sky began to lighten. I had spent the entire night moving, my body running on pure adrenaline. When I finally stumbled back onto a real trail, my legs nearly gave out beneath me. By the time I reached civilization again, I felt like I had been gone for weeks instead of days. I never found out what was out there. I never told anyone the full story, but I haven't gone back since, and I don't think I ever will. I remember that summer vividly. The air was thick with humidity, and the evenings brought a symphony of cicadas that seemed to crescendo as the sun dipped below the horizon. Living in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, had always felt like residing in a serene bubble, far removed from the chaos of the larger cities. The rolling hills, dense woodlands, and tight-knit communities painted a picture of quintessential American suburbia. My home was nestled in a quiet neighborhood, less than a 15-minute drive from Solebury Township. The township was known for its picturesque landscapes and charming local establishments. There was a particular cafe there, with its rustic wooden beams and the aroma of freshly baked bread, where I often took my parents when they visited. We'd sit by the window, sipping on rich coffee, watching the world go by, and sharing stories from the past. Those moments were simple, yet profoundly comforting. July 2017 began like any other. The days were long, filled with the laughter of children playing in sprinklers and families hosting barbecues. But beneath that veneer of normalcy, an undercurrent of unease was beginning to ripple through our community. News spread quickly in small towns, and whispers of missing young men began to circulate. First, it was Jimmy Taro Patrick, a 19-year-old college student. Then Dean Finocchiaro, also 19, followed by Tom Mio, 21, and Mark Sturgis, 22. Each disappearance chipped away at our collective sense of security. I didn't know any of the boys personally, but Bucks County is the kind of place where everyone is connected by just a degree or two. A colleague's son had attended high school with Dean. Tom's family owned a local deli where I'd often grab lunch. The mounting anxiety was palpable. Parents held their children a little tighter, and the usual jovial gatherings at the local park became subdued, conversations dominated by speculation and fear. The local shops and spots that Cosmo DiNardo used as meeting points were familiar to many of us. These were places where we'd run into neighbors, share a quick chat, or simply enjoy the ambience. The idea that these cherished locales had been tainted by such malevolent intentions was deeply unsettling. It felt as though our communal spaces had been violated, their innocence stripped away. What haunted me most was the chilling account of Dean Finocchiaro's final moments. The image of him trying to escape, only to be shot in the back, the relentless gunfire continuing until the ammunition was depleted, and then the unimaginable horror of being run over by a backhoe while still clinging to life. The brutality and sheer inhumanity of it gnawed at my psyche. I found myself lying awake at night, the darkness of my room pressing down on me, as I grappled with the incomprehensible nature of such evil. In the days following the discovery of the boys' bodies, our community was enveloped in a profound grief. A makeshift memorial sprang up at the entrance of the farm where they were found. Hundreds of us gathered, each person carrying flowers, candles, or handwritten notes. The driveway, once just a mundane stretch of gravel, became a sea of tributes, a testament to the lives lost and the community's shared sorrow. I stood among the crowd, the scent of lilies and roses mingling with the summer air, and felt an overwhelming hollowness. Tears streamed down faces, strangers embraced, and a heavy silence hung over us, broken only by the occasional sob. The weeks turned into months, but the weight of the tragedy lingered. Every time I passed by those familiar spots, the cafe, the deli, the park, I was reminded of the fragility of life and the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most idyllic communities. Our sense of security had been shattered, and in its place was a collective resolve to cherish each moment, to look out for one another, and to ensure that the memories of Jimmy, Dean, Tom, and Mark would never fade. The Cosmo DiNardo murders left an indelible mark on all of us. It was a stark reminder that evil can manifest anywhere, even in the places we hold dearest. But amidst the horror and heartbreak, our community found strength and unity, coming together to heal, to remember, and to rebuild the bonds that make Bucks County home. Christmas break freshman year. It was cold outside, the kind of cold where the air burns your lungs when you breathe too fast. But I was warm inside, sitting in the basement, lost in GTA 3. I had gotten the game a few months ago, and it had basically taken over my life. Hours blurred together when I played. The radio stations, the missions, just driving around and causing chaos. It was all hypnotic. I was deep into it, eyes locked on the screen, fingers gripping the controller, barely aware of anything outside the game. Then I heard it. The back door opening and closing. It wasn't weird. My dad usually came home for lunch around this time. I barely glanced away from the TV. Probably him grabbing a sandwich before heading back to work. I kept playing. The game was louder than the quiet sounds of the house. Gunshots, sirens, people screaming as I sped down the sidewalk. Minutes passed. Maybe 20, maybe 30. I wasn't keeping track. But then I heard something that snapped me out of the game completely. Footsteps, coming down the basement stairs. I paused the game, my heart already beating a little too fast. I turned toward the doorway. expecting to see my dad. Maybe I'd ask him for a ride to my friend's house. But as I looked up, I didn't see my dad. It was a man. He wasn't anyone I knew. He was holding a stack of DVDs and my brand new Jordans. We froze. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. I could hear the faint hum of the game in the background, but everything else felt silent, like the entire world had paused for these few seconds. I don't know what my face looked like, but I knew I was trying hard to keep it from showing the panic spreading through my chest. My hands were sweaty, my whole body tensed, but I forced myself to stay still. I could see him gripping the DVDs tightly under one arm, the shoes stuffed under the other. He was breathing a little heavier than normal, like he had been rushing, like he hadn't expected anyone to be here. The silence dragged. It felt like we stood there forever. Then finally he spoke. His voice was low, almost cautious. He asked if Dustin was home. Dustin? I had no idea who the hell Dustin was. I could barely think. My brain was racing too fast, running through every possible scenario of what was happening. But I knew one thing. If I acted scared, this would go bad. I swallowed, steadied myself. I forced my voice to come out normal. I told him no. He didn't move right away. He just stood there, staring at me. Then slowly, he shifted his weight. He nodded once, like he had just confirmed something in his head. And then, he turned around and walked back upstairs. I listened to every step. I heard him reach the top of the stairs. I heard the back door open, then the slam. But I didn't move, because something was wrong. The slam was too obvious, too loud, too deliberate. I sat there, staring at the stairwell, and my gut told me he was still in the house. Waiting, listening. Maybe he thought I would come upstairs. Maybe he was hiding around the corner. Maybe he had a knife, a gun, something worse. Maybe he was deciding if I was a problem he needed to take care of. I wasn't about to find out. I stayed put. I don't know how long I sat there. At first, I tried to breathe quietly, tried to listen for any sounds above me. I was afraid that if I moved, even shifted my weight too much, the couch would creak and he'd hear it. But after a while, the waiting became unbearable. I needed to get out of the basement. I needed to call my parents, the police, someone. But to do that, I had to go upstairs. Every horror movie I'd ever seen was running through my mind. Every scene where someone makes a stupid decision and gets themselves killed. I didn't want to be that person. I stood up slowly. My legs felt stiff. I had been sitting too long. My body felt wrong, like I was moving in slow motion. I took a step forward, then another. I reached the doorway. From here, I could see up the stairs. The kitchen was just beyond that. The back door was up there, but I couldn't tell if it was locked. I couldn't tell if he was still inside. I gritted my teeth and forced myself up the stairs. One step, another. Each creak of the wood beneath me felt like a gunshot. When I reached the top, I stopped. Listened. Nothing. The kitchen was empty. The back door was shut. I took a step forward. The room looked normal, exactly the same as it had been before. But then I noticed something. The deadbolt wasn't locked. My dad always locked it. Always. That meant one of two things. Either my dad hadn't been the one to open it earlier, or the guy was still inside the house. I had to move. Now, I darted toward the phone. The old landline sat on the counter, the coiled cord stretching from the wall. My hands fumbled to pick it up. My fingers shook as I punched in the numbers. I called my dad first. No answer. I called my mom. She picked up. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I must have sounded bad, because the first thing she asked was if I was hurt. I told her someone broke in. She told me to get out of the house. I wanted to. I really did. But I was scared to move, because if he was still here, then I didn't know where he was. I kept my back against the wall, moving slowly toward the front door. My hands were clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms. Then I heard it. A noise. From the hallway. The closet. My stomach dropped. I stepped backward, heart slamming against my ribs. My mouth was dry. The closet door was open just an inch. It hadn't been before. I could see darkness inside. The kind of darkness where someone could be standing there, waiting. I ran. I yanked the front door open and bolted outside, sprinting down the driveway, across the yard, not stopping until I reached the sidewalk. Neighbors were out shoveling snow. I ran to the closest house, banging on the door. An older woman answered. I must have looked insane, but she let me in. I told her what happened. She called the cops. They came fast. My parents got there soon after. The police searched the house. No one was inside, but the closet door, it was still open, and they found footprints in the snow, leading away from the back door. They followed them. They stretched across the yard, down the street, until they disappeared. The man was gone. They never caught him. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like a person. For weeks, I kept checking the back door, locking it, double-checking, triple-checking. We got an alarm system. My parents never left the house unlocked again. I never played GTA 3 in the basement again either. And I never, ever forgot the way he looked at me. I never liked working in food processing plants. The air always smelled sweet but artificial, the kind of sweetness that clings to everything, even the dust. It gets into your clothes, your hair, your lungs. The kind of sweetness that starts to feel sickly after a while. But the money was decent, and when you work for yourself, you take the jobs that come your way. I was a contractor, electrical and mechanical maintenance mostly. Big food plants like the Mott's applesauce facility in Williamson, New York, needed guys like me to keep their automated lines running. The company had their own maintenance team, but they only handled the basic stuff, belt replacements, motor swaps, things like that. When something complicated broke, they called in private guys like me. Cheaper than hiring a full-time specialist. I didn't mind. I liked working alone. No boss breathing down my neck. No coworkers asking me stupid questions. No need to pretend to be friendly. Just me, my tools, and the machines. The job that day wasn't complicated, but it was high up. A controller for one of the conveyor belt arms had been acting up. The plant manager said it would sometimes stop mid-motion and refused to restart unless someone manually reset it. That meant climbing up into the rafters where the wiring ran, balancing on a metal catwalk suspended 30 feet over the production line. I'd done worse. The plant itself was mostly automated. Workers stood at checkpoints monitoring screens, making sure the system didn't flag any issues, but the applesauce itself moved through the process without much human interference. The fruit was washed, mashed, cooked, and piped into jars on a smooth, never-ending belt. Before the lids were sealed, the jars passed through an X-ray machine to check for foreign objects. Anything flagged got kicked off the line. Simple system, but effective. It was loud up in the rafters. The hum of machinery, the whir of motors, the clanking of jars against metal. The catwalk swayed slightly under my weight, a narrow metal grid with gaps between the bars that let you see straight down to the production floor. I found the faulty controller. Just a loose connection, easy fix. I tightened the wire and secured it back into place. Then my foot slipped. I don't know what I stepped on. Maybe a bit of grease, maybe just my own bad luck. But 1 second I was fine, and the next my boot lost traction, and I was falling. I hit the catwalk hard, but I barely felt the pain because something sharp went straight into my right eye. The impact was blinding, a flash of white-hot pain that swallowed everything. I tried to scream, but the wind had been knocked out of me. I gasped, choking on nothing. My hands flailed, trying to grab something, anything, but my body was already twisted at an angle that made it impossible to stop myself. And then I felt it, a wet, sliding sensation. Something came loose. I couldn't see out of my right eye, not just because of the pain, but because it wasn't there anymore. My body convulsed in shock. My left eye barely registered movement below, a blur of motion on the conveyor belt. My arms instinctively clutched at my face, but my right hand meant nothing but the sticky warmth of blood. My eye was gone. I didn't understand it. Not right away. The pain was too much. My body wasn't working right. My legs twitched uselessly. I tried to scream again, but it came out as a choked gurgle. I was still on the catwalk, barely. My right arm dangled off the edge, and my head was pressed against the cold metal. I couldn't move. I couldn't get up. Below me, the conveyor belt carried thousands of small, glass jars of golden applesauce. And in one of them, somewhere in that endless river of processed fruit, my eye was sinking beneath the surface. I didn't know how much time passed. Maybe minutes. Maybe hours. No one saw me. I wasn't an employee. I had no clock-in records, no schedule. The plant manager had let me in, but he wasn't watching me. No one was. I was just another piece of machinery to them. Eventually, the blood loss took me under. Months passed before anyone knew what had happened to me. My body stayed on that catwalk, hidden in the shadows above the machines. The workers below never looked up. Why would they? Their job was to watch the screens, to make sure the machines were running smoothly. No one thought to check the rafters. The applesauce kept moving. Jars were filled, sealed, labeled, packed into boxes, and shipped across the country. And somewhere, inside one of those jars, my eye sat suspended in thick, golden puree. It should have been caught. The X-ray scanner should have flagged it as a foreign object. But it was too late. My eye had fallen in after the checkpoint, right before the lids were sealed. There was no second screening after that. From the plant, the jars went to warehouses. From warehouses, they went to grocery stores. From grocery stores, they went to kitchens. And then nearly a year and a half later, someone found me. Not my body. That would come later. A woman in Pennsylvania was feeding her 2-year-old son applesauce. She had already served him several bowls from the same half-gallon jar. It was nearly empty now. Just a few more scoops left. That's when she saw it. A milky, shriveled sphere floating just beneath the surface. She thought it was a moldy chunk at first. Something rotten, maybe a piece of fruit that hadn't been processed properly. Then she saw the shape of it. The dark center. The unmistakable outline of an iris and pupil. She vomited immediately. Her son, confused, started crying. She called the grocery store first. They dismissed her. Said it was impossible. Said their products were rigorously inspected. She called Mott's. They denied it too. Told her she must have mistaken it for something else. She sent pictures. They ignored her. It wasn't until she threatened a lawsuit that they finally took her seriously. Mott's launched an internal investigation, but they weren't looking for a missing person. They assumed it was a hoax or a one-time contamination error, until someone thought to check the maintenance logs. That's when they realized I had never clocked out. That's when they checked the security footage and saw me enter the building, but never leave. That's when someone finally climbed up into the rafters. By then, I was barely recognizable. A skeleton in a work jacket, still lying on the catwalk, my empty socket staring down at the machines below. The plant shut down for weeks. Mott's paid out a massive settlement to the woman who found my eye. They had to recall thousands of jars, but it was too late to track them all down. Most had already been eaten. And as for me, no funeral, no obituary, just a quiet cleanup and a few paragraphs buried in the news. The applesauce kept moving. It was late summer in 1971, and I was backpacking in Colorado with my friend. We had planned a multi-day hike into the mountains, but the drive had taken longer than expected, and we arrived at the trailhead later than we had hoped. With darkness settling in, and the idea of starting the hike in the pitch-black forest unappealing, we decided to camp near the road for the night. There was a small, flat clearing not far from the trailhead, nestled between the trees and a narrow creek. It wasn't a proper campsite, just a patch of ground where others had clearly set up camp before, judging by the remnants of a fire ring and a few scattered beer cans. We weren't too concerned. We were young, prepared, and had been camping plenty of times before. The idea of sleeping out under the stars, with no tent, just our sleeping bags on the ground, felt natural. The night was warm, and the sky was clear, promising good weather for the next day's hike. After gathering some wood and getting a small fire going, we sat by the flickering flames, cooking a simple meal. We had a little transistor radio with us, one of those small, battery-powered ones, just enough to pick up the AM stations. It crackled as we tuned through the static, trying to find something to listen to. After a few minutes, we picked up a news broadcast. At first, it was just the usual, weather reports, local updates, the kind of things you half listen to while doing something else. Then something made us both stop chewing. There had been a series of murders in the area. The details were vague, but what they did say was enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. 2 separate sets of campers had been attacked. The killer had used an axe. They'd been chopped up in their sleeping bags. No suspects. No known motive. The only thing they knew was that the killer was still at large. We stared at the radio, listening in silence. The broadcast moved on to something else, but neither of us spoke. We just sat there, staring at the fire, our minds running through the possibilities. The state was big. Colorado was huge. But how close had those murders been? And how recently? The news didn't say. We did our best to shake it off, but there was no denying the tension in the air now. Every little sound in the forest suddenly seemed sharper. The rustling of the leaves in the breeze, the crack of a twig somewhere in the darkness, the distant sound of water moving over rocks in the creek. It all felt more pronounced, more important. Still, there was no sense in letting paranoia ruin the night. We banked the fire down to glowing embers and crawled into our sleeping bags. The stars overhead were bright, and aside from the occasional gust of wind, it was quiet. We lay there for a while, neither of us saying anything, both listening. Eventually, my eyelids started to droop. I wasn't sure if I was actually falling asleep or just drifting in and out. But then, a car. The sound of an engine in the distance. Headlights came into view through the trees, moving down the road about 100 feet away, on the other side of the creek. We both sat up instinctively, watching as the car passed. It didn't slow down, just kept moving, its taillights vanishing into the night. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was nothing, just someone driving home, or heading somewhere late at night. Then another car. This one was different. No headlights. The engine was barely audible, rolling slow, like it was coasting in neutral. It came to a stop directly across the creek from where we were. Neither of us moved. We didn't need to talk. Instinct kicked in. We slipped out of our bags as quietly as possible. I reached for my pack, stuffing some clothes into the sleeping bag to make it look occupied. My friend did the same. We nudged the fire, tossing a few branches on the embers, bringing a weak glow back to life. Not enough to fully light up the area, but enough that if someone was watching from the other side of the creek, they'd see a couple of figures still lying by the fire. Then we grabbed our weapons, a small hatchet and a bush knife, and moved silently into the rocks nearby. From our hiding spot, we could just barely see the road through the trees. The car was still there. No movement, no sound, no headlights. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Nothing. The wind whispered through the trees. The creek babbled. Some small animal rustled in the brush. But the car remained silent. My breathing was slow, steady, controlled. I wasn't cold, but I could feel the adrenaline keeping me wired. My muscles coiled like a spring. Every sense was sharp. Every noise, every shift in the wind, every shadow was being cataloged in my brain. More time passed. 30 minutes. 40. An hour. It was hard to say. Time stretched when you were like this, waiting, unsure if you were being watched. Then finally, the engine came to life. Headlights flared on, blinding for a moment as they reflected through the trees. The car turned back onto the road and drove away. We waited, listening as the sound faded into the night. Then we waited even longer, just to be sure. Eventually, we moved. We packed up quickly, not even bothering to properly put out the fire, just enough to make sure it wouldn't spread. The idea of staying there until morning was impossible now. With our packs on, we hiked into the woods under the cover of darkness, moving fast but carefully. We didn't follow the main trail. Instead, we took a less traveled route, something we'd scouted earlier in the day. We didn't talk, didn't use flashlights, just moved. After a couple of miles, we found a concealed spot among thick brush, well off any trail. Only then did we allow ourselves to rest. I didn't sleep much, maybe an hour or two. The sky was just beginning to lighten when I finally let my guard down enough to doze off. By the time the sun was up, it almost felt like a dream. Almost. I never found out if they caught the guy. Never learned if there was even anyone in that car, or if it was just some random event that meant nothing. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was just bad timing. But I do know this. I've never ignored my gut feeling since that night, and I've never slept that close to the road again. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe just to get it out of my head, to lay it all down in words and be done with it. I don't expect anyone to believe me, and honestly, if I were reading this instead of writing it, I probably wouldn't believe it either. This isn't some ghost story. It's not about aliens or demons or whatever else people like to imagine. It's just something that happened, something real, something I can't explain. And if I'm being honest, I don't ever want to explain it. Some things are better left unknown. But I guess I should start from the beginning. It was mid-October, and a couple of friends and I had planned a camping trip near Joshua Tree. We had originally wanted to camp inside the park itself. But of course, we weren't the only ones with that idea. By the time we got there, every single designated campsite was taken. No chance of getting a spot. Not wanting to turn back, we drove a little farther out, past the main areas, and found a spot on some BLM land just outside the park. It wasn't an official campsite, just open desert, the kind of place where you could pull off the road, set up a tent, and no one would bother you. There were no marked trails, no bathrooms, nothing but dry earth, scattered rocks, and the occasional Joshua tree standing like some twisted figure against the sky. We set up camp in a small clearing, a good distance away from the dirt road. There were 3 tents, mine, my girlfriend's, and our 2 friends, arranged in a loose triangle with a small fire pit in the middle. The sky was clear, the moon was almost full, and the air had that perfect desert chill, warm enough in the day but biting at night. The first night was exactly what you'd expect. We cracked open some beers, sat around the fire, and talked about nothing in particular. At one point, I pulled out my telescope to get a look at the stars. Joshua Tree has some of the best stargazing you can get. No city lights, no pollution, just an endless stretch of black sky littered with stars so bright they barely seemed real. After a while, the fire burned low, and one by one, we crawled into our tents. I remember zipping up the door, feeling the sudden silence settle over everything. Out in the desert, there are no distant city sounds, no cars, no hum of electricity. Just the wind, the occasional rustling of dry brush, and the sound of your own breathing. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up, but when I did, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't a noise that woke me up. It wasn't anything I could explain. Just a feeling, a shift in the air. I laid there on my back, staring up at the dark fabric of the tent, my heart already pounding before I even knew why. Next to me, my girlfriend was still asleep, her breathing slow and steady. I held my breath, listening. At first, there was nothing, just the usual night sounds. The wind shifting through the rocks, the distant hoot of an owl. Then, crunch, asterisk. My stomach clenched. It was faint but close. The sound of something moving over the dry dirt. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I turned my head slightly, trying to see if my girlfriend was awake, but I didn't want to move too much. Something about the air, something about the way the sound carried, made me feel like even the smallest movement would give us away. Crunch, asterisk. It was coming from between the tents. Whatever it wasn't moving in a straight line. It wasn't walking past us. It was moving through our camp, weaving between our tents. I could hear it so clearly. Every step, the weight of it pressing into the dirt, the slow shift of gravel underfoot. Then it stopped, right next to our tent. I stopped breathing. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Just silence. And then, a sound. Not a growl. Not a sniff, exactly. But something close. A deep, slow inhaling. Like whatever it was smelling us. A shiver ran down my spine. My girlfriend had woken up by then. I could feel her stiffen next to me, her body suddenly tense. I reached out, just barely brushing my fingers against her arm in a silent signal. Stay quiet. Don't move. We laid there, completely still. The sound of breathing, of something breathing, was just outside the thin fabric of our tent. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. No more sniffing. No more footsteps. No sound at all. Nothing. But that was the weird part. If it had been an animal, if it had been a coyote, a bobcat, even a person, we would have heard it leave. The crunch of dirt, the shuffle of movement. But there was nothing. It didn't walk away. It didn't run. It didn't even retreat a few steps. It just stopped. And in that silence, something felt wrong. Not in a supernatural way. Not in a ghost story way. Just wrong. Like the air had changed. Like something that shouldn't have been there was suddenly gone. We didn't move for a long time. I don't know how long we laid there, listening to nothing, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was the sun rising, golden light spilling over the desert. I sat up slowly, my body aching from how tense I had been. My girlfriend stirred next to me. We didn't say anything. We just looked at each other, both of us knowing we weren't going to talk about it. Outside, everything looked normal. The fire pit was cold. Our friends were still asleep in their tent. The desert stretched out in every direction, empty and quiet. There were no tracks, no footprints, no sign that anything had been there at all. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just an animal, that I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew better, and my girlfriend knew better too. So we made a silent agreement. We weren't going to talk about it. Not to each other, not to our friends. It was better that way. It wasn't until months later, on another camping trip, that it came up again. We were sitting around a fire, the same group of friends, talking about random things when one of them suddenly got quiet. Then he said, "I never wanted to tell you guys this, but that first night in Joshua Tree, I felt something really fucking weird moving between our tents." My stomach dropped. He described it exactly as we had experienced it. The slow, crunching footsteps. The heavy, deliberate breathing. The way it stopped right outside his tent. How he had laid there, frozen, waiting for it to move again. But it never did. He had never told anyone. Just like us. I don't know what happened that night. I don't ever want to know. But I do know one thing. I'm never camping there again. I still remember that chilly evening in late February when the news broke. The air was crisp, and the streets of our city bustled with the usual hum of life. I was at home, sipping on a warm cup of tea, scrolling through social media, when a headline caught my eye. Quadruple homicide shocks local community. My heart raced as I clicked on the article. The victims were a family of 4, the parents, their daughter, and the grandmother. The alleged perpetrator? Their own son, a young man named Hassan. I froze. Hassan. The same Hassan I'd met at several gatherings through my best friend, Sarah? The memories flooded back. His infectious laughter, his playful jabs during game nights, the way he always seemed to light up the room. How could someone so seemingly normal commit such an atrocity? I immediately called Sarah. Her voice trembled as she confirmed the news. She had known Hassan's family for years. Their families were close-knit, sharing countless dinners, celebrations, and stories. Sarah recounted how just a month prior, they had all attended a wedding together. Hassan had been his usual self, joking about his dance moves and teasing Sarah about her competitive nature in board games. There had been no signs, no red flags. As details emerged, the narrative became even more unsettling. Hassan had been enrolled in a prestigious university, a source of immense pride for his family. But unbeknownst to them, he had struggled academically and had eventually dropped out. Fearful of disappointing his parents, he kept this a secret, pretending to attend classes, maintaining the facade of a diligent student. The weight of this deception must have been unbearable. On that fateful night, something inside Hassan snapped. He took the lives of his entire family in a fit of rage and despair. Afterwards, he retreated to his room, turned on his computer, and immersed himself in the virtual world of video games. Hours later, in a chilling confession, he shared his actions with an online friend on Discord, even sending graphic images as proof. Alarmed and horrified, this friend traced Hassan's location and alerted the authorities. When the police arrived, Hassan answered the door calmly, as if nothing had happened. The community was in shock. How could this happen? How could someone so familiar, so ordinary, commit such a heinous act? Conversations with neighbors, friends, and family all echoed the same sentiment. Hassan had always been a kind, respectful young man. He was the last person anyone would suspect capable of such violence. This tragedy forced me to confront a terrifying reality. The human psyche is complex and often hidden beneath layers of social masks. We interact with people daily, believing we know them, trusting in the personas they present. But beneath the surface, there can be struggles, fears, and darknesses we're unaware of. The realization that anyone, regardless of how ordinary they seem, is capable of unimaginable acts shook me to my core. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on another incident that had occurred in our city a few years prior. A young woman, under immense pressure from her strict parents to excel academically, had fabricated her entire university attendance. When her lies began to unravel, she hired men to kill her parents, believing it was the only way to escape the impending shame and disappointment. The parallels between the two cases were haunting. These events made me acutely aware of the pressures that societal and familial expectations can place on individuals. The fear of failure, of not living up to expectations, can drive people to extreme measures. It's a stark reminder of the importance of open communication, understanding, and mental health support. As I sit here now, penning down these thoughts, I can't help but feel a profound sense of loss. Not just for the victims, but for Hassan as well, a young man who felt so trapped by his circumstances that he saw no other way out. The vibrant community gatherings, once filled with laughter and joy, now carry an undercurrent of sorrow and introspection. This tragedy has left an indelible mark on our community. It's a somber reminder that behind every smile, there might be untold stories of struggle, and that sometimes the most ordinary facade can conceal the most extraordinary turmoil. Camping in remote places had never bothered me. I liked the silence, the dark skies full of stars, the feeling of being far from people. It was the reason we had picked this campsite, out in the middle of the English countryside, far from cities, far from noise. It was the kind of place where if you heard something at night, it wasn't a car or a neighbor. It was something else. There were 5 of us on this trip, and we were the only campers on the site. It wasn't much, just a flat clearing near a small patch of woods, a toilet block a short walk away, and a wire gate leading to the footpath back to the main road. No staff, no other tents, no lights except what we brought with us. The first night was cold but still. I fell asleep quickly, zipped deep into my sleeping bag. At some point, I woke up to movement in my tent. My friend was shaking my shoulder. I was groggy, confused. His face was pale in the dim glow of his flashlight. He had just gone to the toilets, but something had stopped him. As he'd turned the corner around the building, he had seen a light, a tiny LED, at head height, behind the block. He had frozen in place, staring at it, unsure of what he was looking at. Then suddenly it had moved, darted away, quick and deliberate. A person. That was the first thing he had thought. Someone had been standing there, watching. Now he was standing over me, wide-eyed, whispering that we had to go look. I was still waking up, but my pulse was already picking up. I sat up, unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, and grabbed my flashlight. The air outside was damp and cold. The others were still asleep in their tents. The 2 of us walked carefully toward the toilet block, moving slow, scanning the dark with our lights. The moment we passed it, we flicked them on full power, shining them into the trees, the bushes behind the building. Nothing. No movement, no sound. We searched for nearly 15 minutes. My adrenaline was pumping, but there was nothing to find. No footprints in the mud, no sign of anyone. Just stillness. Eventually, we gave up and went back to our tents, but I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening. In the daylight, we searched again. The ground was soft in places, so if someone had walked there, we should have seen something. But there were no clear footprints, just a few scuffs that could have been anything. We checked the bushes behind the toilet block, where my friend had seen the light. There was a space back there. If someone had been standing there, they would have had a view of the campsite, but would have been mostly hidden. There was even a bit of toilet paper caught in a branch, like someone had gone back there before. It was unsettling, but without real proof, we tried to explain it away. Maybe it had been a reflection from his headlamp. Maybe an animal, some nocturnal creature with reflective eyes. It made sense when we said it out loud, but part of me didn't believe it. Still, the day passed without anything strange happening. We walked, cooked over the fire, talked. By the time the sun went down, I had almost forgotten about it. I woke up again, but this time no one was shaking me awake. Something had pulled me out of sleep, something outside. I lay there, still and silent, breathing slowly, listening. There was movement. Light, careful movement, like someone was trying not to be heard. A slow step, then a pause. Another step. I turned my head toward the sound, staring at the thin fabric of my tent. Then I saw it. A light. Small but bright, an LED at head height, moving slowly. And below it, another one, slightly dimmer. Yellow and green. It was not an animal. It was not a reflection. It was a person. My stomach clenched. I went completely still. My breath slowed. Whoever it was, they were close. The lights moved, shifting as they turned their heads, scanning. I could hear the faint crunch of their steps on the damp grass. They circled, pacing slowly around the tent. I wanted to move, but I was frozen. If I turned on my light, they would see me, but I wouldn't be able to see them. If I unzipped my tent, they would hear it. I was trapped. Then I heard something else. The gate. A soft, distant clang. The lights disappeared. The movement stopped. Silence. I lay there for a few minutes, heart pounding. Then I forced myself to move. I reached over and shook my friend awake. He blinked at me, confused, and I whispered, "He's back." We grabbed our flashlights and unzipped the tent as fast as we could, stepping out into the cold. We shone our lights in every direction, ran toward the gate, looked down the path. Nothing. The night was completely still. We stayed outside for nearly an hour, searching, but we never found a single sign of anyone. I didn't sleep after that. I lay in my tent, gripping my flashlight, staring at the walls of fabric, waiting for the first hint of morning. We weren't going to sleep that night. We didn't tell the others what had happened. There was no point in making them paranoid too. But we had made up our minds. We were going to stay up, outside, hidden, waiting. That night, after everyone had gone to their tents, we positioned ourselves in the shadows near the edge of the clearing, where we could see everything. We stayed low, our lights off, our eyes adjusted to the dark. The night was completely still. No wind, no rustling. We waited. Every sound made my pulse jump. The snap of a twig in the distance. The rustle of something small moving through the grass. We sat there, tense, listening. But nothing happened. No movement near the tents. No lights appearing in the dark. The hours crawled by, and the sky slowly began to lighten. Eventually, the others woke up, unzipping their tents, stretching. We stood, stiff and tired, and looked around one last time. There was nothing. Whoever it was, they hadn't come back. Maybe they had realized we were onto them. Maybe they had been watching for longer than we knew. I packed up my tent that morning with a strange feeling in my chest. I had camped dozens of times before. I had spent nights alone in the woods. But this was different, because I knew what I had seen. I knew that every time I had thought I heard something at night and brushed it off as the wind, there was a chance I had been wrong. And this time I was right. I never thought I'd look back on this trip with anything other than regret. When my boyfriend and I decided to go backpacking in the mountains, I imagined peaceful trails, a quiet night under the stars, and the rewarding exhaustion of a day spent hiking. What I got instead was 6 miles of pure hell, an encounter with a man I still can't explain, and a night that could have ended in something far worse than dehydration. I should have known things weren't going to go as planned the moment we set out. The day started with frustration. Our map showed a parking lot that didn't exist. We drove in circles, trying to find the right starting point, only to realize the map was flat out wrong. There was no parking lot where it claimed there would be. Already annoyed and behind schedule, we had to rethink our route. Instead of starting at the bottom of the mountain and hiking up, we had no choice but to drive up the mountain and park at the top. This meant our hike would begin with a descent, easy enough, but we'd have to make the brutal climb back up the following day. I'd been camping before, but this was my first time backpacking, actually carrying everything I needed on my back instead of pulling up to a campsite with a car full of supplies. I wasn't used to the weight of the pack, and I wasn't used to hiking long distances with it, but I was excited. Even though we'd already hit a setback, I figured we could still have a good trip. We finally found a lot at the top of the mountain, parked the car, and set off. The plan was to hike down the mountain, find a good spot to camp, and make our way back up the next day. The sun was already getting lower in the sky, and the air was heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. About an hour into our hike, as the light turned golden with the setting sun, we saw someone sitting off to the side of the trail. He was hunched over a small gas stove, cooking something. His setup was minimal, no tent, no real camping gear, just him, his stove, and a few scattered belongings. At first, he looked normal enough, just another hiker. But when he glanced up at us, something felt off. His eyes were slightly unfocused, and his expression was difficult to read, like he wasn't entirely present. He asked if we knew where we were, and if we could help him figure out how to get to a certain spot on the mountain. That seemed normal enough. Hikers ask for directions all the time, but the more he talked, the less sense his story made. He said a friend had dropped him off and was supposed to pick him up at one location, but then he changed the story and said his car was actually parked at another spot. Then, he mentioned a second friend who had hiked with him but turned back and was waiting in a car somewhere. The details kept shifting, and none of it added up. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. Something about him just didn't sit right. My boyfriend and I both nodded along, offering vague answers, and then we moved on as quickly as we could without making it seem like we were in a hurry. The trail was poorly marked, and as we continued, the map we had didn't match what we were seeing. We expected clear signs and well-maintained paths, but instead, we found ourselves on a narrow, uneven trail that led to a barbed wire fence on both sides. It looked like a horse trail, not a hiking path, but there were no signs to tell us otherwise. The sky was getting darker, and we were losing daylight fast. We decided to keep following the trail, hoping we'd find a clearing where we could set up camp for the night. But then, up ahead, the path was blocked by a massive puddle, more like a small pond in the middle of the trail. It was too wide to jump and too deep to wade through without soaking our boots. Frustrated and exhausted, we decided to turn back, figuring we'd camp somewhere earlier along the trail where the ground was dry and clear. As soon as we turned around, I felt it, that deep, primal sense of being watched. I looked back, and there he was, the man from earlier, standing on the trail behind us. I don't know how long he had been there, but he hadn't been making any noise. He hadn't called out to us or made his presence known. He was just standing there. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe he had just ended up on the same trail by coincidence. He started talking again, rambling about something I barely processed because I was too focused on how close he was now. And then, out of nowhere, he mentioned drugs. Heavy narcotics. Fentanyl. Another name I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped. I wanted out. My boyfriend and I exchanged a quick glance, the kind that says everything without a word. We turned and walked fast. Then we ran. The 6 miles back to the car stretched ahead of us like a death sentence. We were already exhausted, already dehydrated, and now we were practically sprinting up the mountain, pushing our bodies past their limits just to get away from that man. The heat pressed down on us, thick and suffocating. Every step burned. My pack felt like it had doubled in weight. My throat was so dry it hurt to swallow, but we didn't dare stop. I lost track of time, lost track of everything except the desperate need to reach the top. My legs ached, and my vision blurred at the edges. My head throbbed from dehydration. The water in my pack was useless. I was too far gone for a few sips to help. Somehow we made it. 6 miles in just under 2 hours. A climb that should have taken much longer, covered in sheer, adrenaline-fueled terror. When we reached the parking lot, I couldn't take another step. I collapsed onto a bench, my entire body screaming in protest. My boyfriend went to get the car. I watched him disappear around the curve of the lot, suddenly feeling very alone. The night was eerily quiet. The trees loomed dark against the sky. My heart was still hammering in my chest. Then, in the distance, I heard something move. A rustle in the trees. A shift in the silence. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to stay calm. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car's headlights cut through the darkness. My boyfriend pulled up, and I forced myself to my feet, stumbling into the car. We drove out of the park in silence, the road winding through the mountains, the only sound the hum of the tires on the pavement. Then, as we neared the exit, I saw it. A sign. Warning. Hitchhikers may be escaped convicts. I stared at it, feeling a cold chill crawl down my spine despite the heat. Neither of us said anything. We didn't have to. We pulled into a gas station a while later, too drained to drive all the way home. We slept in the car for a few hours, the parking lot lights buzzing overhead, my mind still racing. I don't know who that man was. I don't know where he went after we left him on the trail. But I do know one thing. We were lucky. Lucky we turned back when we did. Lucky we made it up that mountain. Lucky we got out of there alive. I never liked being alone in the house at night. It wasn't that I was scared of ghosts or anything like that. I didn't believe in all that. What scared me were the things people were actually capable of. The things that had happened in real life, not in some movie or campfire story. I guess that's why I'm thinking about my grandmother now. She always kept her screen door locked when strangers came knocking. Always. She wasn't rude about it, but she didn't take chances, not even in our quiet neighborhood. It was a habit, something she had probably done for so long that it was just muscle memory at that point. She would open the inside door but leave the screen latched, standing there in her slippers and house dress, one hand gripping the frame. If she wasn't interested in what you were selling, that was the end of the conversation. I think about that a lot, because if she hadn't been that way, she might have ended up like the woman next door. It happened in the early 2000s, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I was a teenager then, living in Grand Prairie, Texas. My grandmother had lived in her house for years, in a neighborhood full of older folks who had settled in and stayed put. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. People sat on their porches in the evenings, watered their lawns, and waved at passing cars. It felt safe. I don't think any of us understood how quickly that could change. There was a man going door to door that day, selling magazines. It wasn't anything unusual. People were always trying to sell something. My grandmother saw him coming up the walk through the front window. She waited until he knocked before opening the door, but left the screen locked. He started his pitch, talking about whatever subscription he was trying to push, and she cut him off, telling him she wasn't interested. Then she stepped back and let the door close. Simple as that. The man didn't argue. He just nodded, turned, and walked next door. The woman who lived there, I'll call her Mrs. Carter, was the kind of neighbor you'd say hello to, maybe chat with for a few minutes while grabbing the mail. She was older, lived alone, and had adult children who visited often. She was friendly. She trusted people. So when the man knocked on her door, she let him in. She let him in. That's what haunts me the most. I try to imagine what it was like for her, sitting across from him in her own living room, maybe politely listening as he talked about magazines, completely unaware of what was about to happen. At what point did she realize she had made a mistake? Did he stand up suddenly? Did his voice change? Did she have even a second to react before he was on her? I'll never know. I only know what happened afterward. He attacked her. He overpowered her. He hurt her in ways I can't bring myself to write down. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he set her on fire. I don't know how she put it out. Maybe she rolled. Maybe she managed to get to water. Maybe it just didn't spread fast enough. But she survived. Her son found her about 45 minutes later. I imagine him knocking, waiting, knocking again. Maybe he had a key. Maybe he opened the door and stepped inside, calling out to her. Maybe he smelled the smoke before he even saw her. What do you even do when you find your mother like that? The man was long gone by then. I don't know if they ever caught him. I never wanted to know his name. It didn't matter. He could have easily chosen my grandmother instead. I hate thinking about that. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I can't help it. That story always made me sick. But there was another one that haunted me even more. It happened in Texas too. I didn't know the family personally, but I remember hearing about it on the news. A mother of 5, all her children under the age of 7. She had a history of mental illness, a history of trying to harm herself. Her family knew. Her husband knew. They had a system in place to make sure she was never left alone with the kids. But one day, there was a small window of time. Just a short gap where she was alone in the house before her own mother was supposed to arrive. And that was all it took. She ran a bath. She drowned them one by one. I don't know how long it took. I don't want to know. But I think about the house, the way it must have looked that day. Toys on the floor. Half-eaten snacks left on the kitchen counter. Maybe the TV was still on, playing some kids' show in the background. The sound of it completely disconnected from the horror happening just down the hall. I think about the silence that must have followed. I think about the grandmother arriving, knocking, waiting. Maybe she let herself in. Maybe she called out for her daughter. Maybe she stepped into the bathroom, and I can't even finish that thought. Some people believe in ghosts. Some people think that when something terrible happens, the place remembers. I don't know about that. But I do know that there are houses where unspeakable things have happened, and those houses don't look any different from the ones around them. They still have curtains in the windows, cars in the driveway, Christmas lights in December. People walk past them every day without a second thought. I wonder if they know. I wonder if they ever get that strange, creeping feeling when they walk by, like the air is just a little too still, the silence just a little too heavy, like something awful happened there, and the walls soaked it in. Maybe that's why I don't like being alone at night. Not because of ghosts, because of the things that actually happened. Boundary Waters trips were tradition. Every year, my uncle, my cousin, and I would load up the canoes, pack enough food to last a week, and push off into the remote lakes and forests of northern Minnesota. It was the kind of place where the air smelled like pine and damp earth, where the nights were so dark you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and where the only sounds were the lapping of water and the occasional rustle of something moving through the undergrowth. We had been out there for 3 days, setting up camp on a narrow strip of land wedged between the lake and a thick stand of trees. The water was calm, reflecting the sky like glass, and the forest loomed behind us, dense and quiet. During the day, we fished, paddled from one cove to the next, and cooked meals over the fire. At night, we sat around the flames, telling stories that were probably half-lies but entertaining enough to keep us up long after we should have been sleeping. That night was no different. We had eaten a meal of fish and instant mashed potatoes, cleaned up as best we could, and settled in around the fire, watching the flames twist and snap. The air had a bite to it, the kind of cold that settled in once the sun dipped below the tree line. Above us, the sky was clear, stars smeared across it like a spilled bag of sugar. I was getting tired. My body ached from paddling all day, and my head felt heavy from the heat of the fire. I stood up, stretching, ready to call it a night. The tents were set back from the fire, a little closer to the woods than I liked, but we had no choice. The ground by the shore was too uneven for a proper setup. The moment I stepped away from the fire, I heard it. A rustling. It came from the trees. Nothing big, just a shuffle of leaves, the snap of a twig. Probably a raccoon, maybe a squirrel. I turned my head, squinting into the dark. The firelight didn't reach that far, but I could just make out the movement of branches. I didn't think much of it at first. There were animals all over these woods, and most of them were small, harmless. But then the rustling turned into something else. A deep, steady thrashing. Leaves and branches shook violently. The sound loud enough that I immediately tensed. It wasn't some little animal skittering around the undergrowth. This was something bigger, heavier. The noise had weight to it. The ground almost seemed to tremble underfoot as whatever it was moved closer. I wasn't the only one who heard it. My uncle and cousin had both stopped talking, their faces turning toward the noise. The fire crackled between us, but none of us moved. Then we heard the grunt. Low, deep. A sound I felt more than heard, like it rattled inside my chest. Another grunt followed, this one closer. None of us spoke. We just moved, grabbing anything within reach. I reached for the frying pan, grip tightening around the handle. My cousin picked up the canoe paddle. My uncle grabbed the axe. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. The thrashing got louder, closer. The trees swayed, and I realized just how big whatever was in there had to be. Then, with one final crash, it emerged. A moose. A massive moose. It stepped out from the trees, branches snapping beneath its hooves, its dark body towering over the campsite. Even in the dim firelight, I could see how huge it was. Easily over 6 feet at the shoulders, its antlers stretching out like the branches of a dead tree. I did not move. None of us did. The moose stood there, nostrils flaring, breath visible in the cold air. Its dark eyes swept over us, reflecting the firelight in a dull, glassy way. It grunted again, shifting its weight, ears flicking back. My fingers were clenched so tight around the frying pan that my hands started to cramp. My heart was pounding, and I could hear my own breathing, shallow, controlled, the kind of breathing you do when you don't want to be noticed. The moose took a step forward. The firelight danced across its thick fur, the muscles shifting beneath its hide as it moved. I had seen moose before, but never this close, never like this. It was different when they were across the lake, grazing by the shore. Up close, they were terrifying. It sniffed at the air. I wondered if it smelled our dinner, but we had packed everything away, tied it up in a tree like we were supposed to. Maybe it was just curious. Maybe it had wandered into our camp by accident. But another part of me knew better. Moose weren't harmless. People liked to think they were, but they could be just as dangerous as bears. If this one decided we were a threat, or worse, if it was in a bad mood, there was nothing stopping it from charging. It took another step, hooves pressing into the dirt, and my muscles locked up. 30 yards, maybe less. That was all the distance between us. A moose could close that gap in seconds. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it turned its head and lost interest. It walked through our campsite, sniffing at the ground, stepping over the logs we had dragged for seating like they were nothing. It paused near the edge of the fire's glow, lifted its head, and sniffed again. Then, with a deep breath, it exhaled, a long, tired sound, almost human in its exhaustion. And then it was gone. It walked into the trees, its body vanishing into the darkness like it had never been there. The sound of its hooves faded, replaced by the normal quiet of the woods. I did not move for a long time. Eventually, my uncle exhaled, and it was like we all remembered how to breathe at the same time. My fingers ached from how hard I had been gripping the frying pan. My cousin's knuckles were white where he held the canoe paddle. Nobody said anything. We put out the fire, checked our gear, and then, without discussion, packed up camp the next morning. We didn't stay another night. Didn't wait to see if it would come back. We moved. We didn't talk much about it afterward. It was just one of those things. Something that happened. Something you remembered when you lay awake at night. staring at the ceiling, wondering just how close you had come to something worse. We kept going back to the Boundary Waters year after year, but we never camped in that spot again. I don't know why we decided to stay there that night. Maybe it was the acid, or maybe it was just the weird pull of the place. Either way, my buddy and I made a bad call. We'd been hiking all afternoon, working our way up an old, overgrown trail that barely existed on any maps. It was one of those places you only find by accident or word of mouth, deep in the woods, far from anything. We'd taken a few tabs of LSD earlier in the day, and by the time the sun started dipping behind the trees, we were in that strange, weightless state where everything feels connected, like the forest itself was breathing with us. The air smelled like damp leaves and old wood, the sky turning orange and purple above the treetops. That's when we found the cabin. It looked abandoned but sturdy enough. Old Boy Scout structure, maybe from the 50s or 60s, built from thick logs with a tin roof that had rusted in places. The windows were mostly intact, though one had a big crack running through it, and the door hung a little crooked on its hinges. There was a stone fire pit out front, half buried in leaves. Inside, it smelled like dust and rot, but the floor seemed solid. We weren't about to hike any further in the dark, so we decided to stay. As we set up for the night, rolling out sleeping bags and getting a small fire going, we both started to notice something, a low hum, just on the edge of hearing. At first, we thought it was just in our heads. The way sound works when you're tripping, it's easy to get lost in little noises, the wind in the trees, the creak of old wood. But this was different. This wasn't the wind. It was steady, constant. A deep vibration that we felt more than we heard. We looked at each other. Neither of us said anything, but we knew we had to check it out. About 100 yards from the cabin, we found the barn. It was old, older than the cabin for sure, built from gray, weathered wood that looked like it would fall apart if you leaned on it too hard. The roof sagged in the middle, and the doors hung open just enough to see darkness inside. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the way it looked, it was the sound. The humming was coming from the foundation. The barn had been built on a raised dirt platform, maybe a foot high, and that platform was moving. At first, it didn't make sense. Then we got closer. Mud daubers, thousands of them. They covered the entire foundation, crawling over each other in a thick, shifting mass of black and yellow. The humming wasn't just a sound, it was a physical presence, a vibration in the air that we could feel in our chests. The closer we got, the more it resonated through us, like standing next to a massive speaker playing a song with no sound. I could see them shifting, working, their little black legs digging into the dirt, their wings flickering. Some of them flew in slow, looping patterns, circling the barn like they were protecting something. I could feel my breathing change. I wasn't afraid of bees or wasps, not really. But this was different. This was wrong. There were too many. No hive should be this big, this dense. It felt unnatural, like the barn was alive, breathing with them. We didn't speak. We just backed away, slow and careful. The humming followed us, fading only slightly as we returned to the cabin. I don't remember who broke first, but as soon as we were inside, we slammed the door shut and looked at each other. Neither of us wanted to talk about it. Instead, we focused on the fire. We built it up, maybe bigger than necessary, just to have something real in front of us. We unpacked our food, some instant ramen, a can of chili, whatever else we had in our bags. The sound of the fire crackling, the smell of the wood smoke, the warmth, it helped push the memory of the barn back, at least for a little while. Then, out of nowhere, a man walked out of the woods. He came from the north, moving slow but steady. He wasn't dressed for hiking, just old jeans, a faded flannel, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He looked like he belonged out there, like he'd been walking those woods his whole life. I felt my stomach tighten. There was only one trail leading in, and it was to the west. We hadn't seen a single person all day. There were no signs of campsites nearby, no lights, no sounds of other hikers. Just us. But he wasn't surprised to see us. He walked up to the fire like he'd been expecting it. Like it wasn't unusual to find two guys out here, cooking dinner in front of an abandoned cabin. I don't know why, but we didn't question it. Maybe it was the way he moved, calm and unbothered, like he belonged there more than we did. Maybe it was the drugs, making everything feel like a story instead of reality. We let him sit. He told us about the cabin, about how it used to be part of an old Boy Scout camp, back before the area was forgotten. about how the barn had been there even longer, built when this land was still worked by farmers, long before the scouts came through. He spoke slow, like he had all the time in the world, his voice low and steady over the crackle of the fire. We listened. I couldn't tell you how long he stayed, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Time felt strange. But at some point, he stood up, nodded once, and walked away. Not toward the trail, not back the way he came. He walked south into the trees, where there was nothing but thick underbrush and darkness. We watched him go. We sat in silence for a long time after that, staring into the fire, listening to the night sounds. The humming was still out there, somewhere beyond the trees, a constant, unseen presence just at the edge of hearing. Eventually, we went inside, locking the door behind us, even though we knew it wouldn't really stop anything. We lay in our sleeping bags, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. By morning, the woods were silent. The barn was still there. The mud daubers were still working. But the man, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there at all. To this day, we call him the spirit of the woods. But I don't think he was a ghost. I think he was just a man who knew those woods better than we ever could. Someone who lived out there, unnoticed, moving through the trees like they were his home. Or maybe he was something else, something older. We never went back. I was stationed at a Marine base in the late 60s. I don't need to say where. If you've been on one, you know the kind. Long, windowless barracks, metal bunks stacked too high, and that heavy stale air that never quite goes away no matter how often you air out the place. This was over a holiday weekend, which meant most of the guys had taken off. It wasn't completely deserted, but it was close. Quiet enough that you could hear every footstep in the hall, every creak of the old building settling. I was one of the unlucky ones who had to stay behind. I didn't mind much. The solitude was a nice break from the usual noise, and I planned to sleep in as much as I could. I had the top bunk in my room, a stiff mattress that I'd long since gotten used to. The guy assigned to the bottom bunk had left for the weekend, so I had the place to myself. That night, I went to bed early, sometime around 2,200 hours. There wasn't much else to do. The few guys still on base had either gone out drinking or were keeping to themselves. The hallway lights outside were dim, and the room itself was nearly pitch black, except for the faint glow from the emergency exit sign down the hall. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The air in the room felt different, thicker somehow. Still, but expectant, like the moment just before a storm breaks. I lay there for a second, not moving, just listening. There was no sound, no footsteps in the hall, no voices. Just that low, steady hum of the building itself. Then I heard it. A voice. Close. Too close. Right beside my bunk. Wake up. You need to come with us. My whole body tensed. I turned my head slightly, just enough to look, but I couldn't see anyone. The room was empty. Just shadows and the faint outline of my locker against the wall. I wasn't the type to scare easily, but something about the voice sent a deep, instinctive shiver through me. It hadn't sounded like someone talking from across the room. It had been right next to me, low and even like a statement rather than a request. I didn't bother to sit up. I just muttered, "Fuck you, I'm going back to sleep," rolled over and shut my eyes. If some asshole was messing with me, they could go find someone else. Morning came slow. When I woke up, the room was bright with that dull, grayish-white light that comes from overcast skies. The first thing I did was sit up and look around. Nothing seemed out of place. My locker was shut, my boots were still by the bed, and the door was closed. It felt stupid now, the way I'd reacted. Probably just a dream. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. I didn't think about it again until breakfast. I sat down across from another guy who had also stayed on base for the weekend. He was stationed a few doors down from me. We weren't particularly close, but when there's only a handful of people around, you end up talking to whoever's there. "I had the weirdest dream last night," he said, stirring his coffee, looking tired. I didn't think much of it until he kept going. I was asleep, and a voice woke me up. Said, "Get up. You need to come with us." I froze. He kept talking, staring down at his plate, like he wasn't sure he should even be saying this out loud. I rolled over, and there was this, he hesitated, shaking his head slightly, as if the act of saying it would make it sound even crazier. There was this little guy standing there, about 4 feet tall, but wearing a beige jumpsuit, just staring at me, waiting. He let out a short, forced laugh, trying to shake it off, but it was obvious the memory still had its claws in him. I pulled the blanket over my head, and that's the last thing I remember. I didn't answer right away. My coffee had gone cold, but I didn't move to take another sip, because I had heard the exact same words. Only I hadn't seen anything, and now I knew why. The thing, whatever it was, had been too short for me to see over the edge of my bunk. I told him about my experience, keeping my voice low, just in case anyone else was listening. By the time I finished, his expression had gone tight. He glanced around, making sure no one was nearby, then leaned in a little. "You ask anyone else?" "Not yet." We decided to check with the guys who had been on guard duty that night. If someone had come through, they would have seen them. The base wasn't big, and the security detail had rounds they had to walk every hour. There was no way an outsider could have just wandered in. We found one of the guards later that afternoon and asked casually if anything weird had happened the night before. He just looked at us like we were crazy. "No one came through," he said. "I was at the main entrance all night. If someone had gone in or out, I'd know about it." We didn't push it. There was no point. For the rest of the weekend, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had dodged something, barely. Like there had been a door left open just a crack, and whatever was on the other side had reached for me, just for a moment, before I rolled over and let sleep take me again. The other guy felt the same way. We didn't talk about it much after that. There was no explanation that made sense, and the more we tried to analyze it, the less it added up. The weekend ended, the other Marines returned, and the base was full again. The silence was gone, replaced by the usual background noise of daily life, and that strange, heavy feeling disappeared with it. But every so often, late at night, when I was lying in my bunk with my eyes closed, I'd feel something stir at the edge of my thoughts. A voice, low, even, waiting. The first time I remember feeling afraid, really afraid, was when I was 6 years old. It wasn't the kind of fear that made you scream or cry. It was the kind that made you quiet. The kind that made you smaller, careful, invisible. I learned young that noise could mean pain. That looking the wrong way, answering too slowly, standing too close, or too far away, could mean trouble. I was born into a house where love was twisted into something else, where kindness was currency, and you never knew if you had enough to get through the day. My mother, Teresa, had a way of turning love into fear and obedience into survival. She didn't need to raise her voice often because we already knew what would happen if we didn't listen. We all knew. There were 6 of us, 3 boys, 3 girls, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like 2 families, split by something I didn't understand when I was little. The boys were treated better, or maybe just less badly. They still got hit, still got punished, but there was something different about the way my mother looked at them. The way she spared them from the worst of it. The girls weren't so lucky. As we grew up, things got worse. My oldest sister, Suzanne, was the first to bear the brunt of it. She was the prettiest, and my mother hated that. She used to glare at her like she had stolen something from her, something precious. I didn't understand what, not then, but I could see it in her eyes. Jealousy, hatred. Susan tried to fight back sometimes. She would argue, talk back in ways I was too scared to. She wasn't stupid, she knew what would happen, but some part of her just couldn't stay quiet. And that's why she suffered the most. I remember when my mother first started locking her up. She'd force her into a closet, shut the door, and leave her there for hours. It didn't matter if she begged, if she cried, if she swore she'd be good. We'd sit at the dinner table, eating whatever scraps we had, pretending not to hear her behind the door. The first time she was shot, I wasn't there. None of us were, except for my mother and Suzanne. I don't know what set her off that night, what words were said, what look was given. All I know is that when I saw my sister again, she was different. Quieter, slower. The bullet was still in her. My mother said she could fix it herself. She cut it out of her in the bathtub. No anesthesia, no doctors, just a knife and a bottle of rubbing alcohol. I didn't see it happen, but I heard it. I remember covering my ears with my hands, pressing down so hard that my head hurt. But I still heard her screaming. After that, she never got better. She was feverish, weak, barely able to stand. My mother said she was faking it, that she just wanted attention, so she got rid of her. We didn't ask questions when she told us to get in the car. We just went. My brothers drove, my mother sat in the front, and I sat in the back, staring at Susan slumped against the door, barely moving. When we got to the spot, somewhere deep in the woods, our mother pulled her out. I remember the way she struggled, the way she tried to stand but couldn't, the way she looked at us. I turned away. We didn't watch as she doused her in gasoline. We didn't watch as she lit the match. We just stood there. And when we drove home, no one said a word. After Susan was gone, the house felt quieter. Not peaceful, just empty in a way that made my skin crawl. But it didn't take long for my mother to turn her attention to Sheila. She was different from Susan. She didn't fight back as much. Maybe she had learned from what happened to our sister. Maybe she thought that being quiet, being good, would save her. It didn't. By then, none of us were in school anymore. My mother didn't want teachers asking questions. Sheila was forced to work, prostitution, she said. It was her job to bring in money. When she didn't, she paid for it. The beatings got worse. The punishments became longer. And then one day, she wasn't allowed out anymore. Sheila was locked in the closet. At first, she would cry. Then she stopped. Then she begged. Then she stopped. Then we didn't hear anything at all. It smelled before we realized she was dead. It was summer, and the heat made everything worse. When my mother finally opened the door, she just stood there for a long time, staring. Then she told my brothers to get rid of her. They buried her in a field. And then it was just me. I had spent my whole life watching, waiting, learning what not to do. But it didn't matter. My mother had killed 2 daughters. There was no reason she wouldn't kill me too. One night, we got into an argument. I don't even remember what it was about. But I saw something change in her eyes. Something that made my stomach drop. Then she shot me. The pain was blinding. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. I remember falling, my hands pressing against the wound, feeling the warmth of my own blood. I thought I was going to die right there. But she didn't want me dead. Not yet. She said I could leave. On one condition. She had to take the bullet out. I knew what had happened to Susan. I knew how it had ended. But I didn't have a choice. The bathtub was cold when I stepped in. The knife was sharper than I thought it would be. And the pain, God, the pain. It got infected. I knew it would. I was sick for days, maybe weeks. I lost track of time. But somehow I survived. And then I ran. I didn't have money. I didn't have an ID. But I had Sheila's. And that was enough. I was 16 years old when I left home. For years, I tried to tell people what had happened. I went to the police, to doctors, to anyone who would listen. No one believed me. They thought I was crazy, that I was making it up. I carried the weight of my sister's deaths alone. Then one night, I saw a TV show about an unsolved case. They were talking about a burned body, found in the woods. I knew it was Susan. I called the police one last time. This time, they listened. My mother was arrested in 1993. She was sentenced to 2 life terms. She'll be eligible for parole in 2027. I won't be around to see it. I lived long enough to see her go to prison. Long enough to make sure no one else would suffer the way we did. And then my body gave out. I was too sick, too broken. But at least I was free. I remember that summer vividly. We were a group of 4 teenage boys, eager for adventure and the freedom that came with the long, warm days. The Appalachian Mountains called to us with their dense forests and winding trails, promising the kind of escapades we had only read about in books. We set out early one July morning, our backpacks heavy with camping gear and enough food to last us several days. The sun was already climbing high, casting dappled light through the canopy as we made our way along the ridge. The trail was narrow, hugging the mountainside, with steep drop-offs that sent shivers down my spine if I dared to look too long. As the afternoon sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the landscape, we trudged along the ridge, laughter and banter filling the air. The weight of our packs pressed down on our shoulders, but our spirits remained high. The trail, a narrow ribbon of dirt, clung to the mountainside, offering glimpses of the valley below through gaps in the foliage. The scent of pine and earth was intoxicating, a reminder of the wild beauty surrounding us. Suddenly, a rustling noise from below caught our attention. We halted, peering through the trees to discern its source. The underbrush quivered and faint murmurs, almost like whispers, reached our ears. Curiosity piqued, we shrugged off our packs, letting them rest against the trunks of nearby trees. We exchanged puzzled glances, each of us silently daring the other to investigate. "Did you hear that?" one of us whispered, breaking the silence. "Yeah," another replied, eyes wide with intrigue. Before we could decide on our next move, a loud crack echoed through the valley. Our eyes snapped to the source of the sound just in time to see a tree tipping over, crashing to the ground with a thunderous boom. Atop the fallen trunk, a small black bear cub clung desperately, its eyes wide with fear. Time seemed to freeze as we processed the scene before us. Panic surged through me. We had learned in our preparatory research that encountering a bear cub was perilous. The mother was often nearby, and black bears were known to be fiercely protective of their young. Our youthful bravado evaporated instantly, replaced by cold, hard fear. "Back up slowly," I hissed, my voice barely audible. We retraced our steps, each movement deliberate and cautious, hearts pounding in unison. Reaching our packs, we hoisted them silently, muscles tense and ready to bolt at the slightest sign of danger. As we retreated up the trail, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent jolts of adrenaline through our veins. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a safer distance and allowed ourselves to breathe. The realization of how close we had come to a potentially deadly encounter settled over us, leaving us shaken but wiser. That night, around the campfire, we recounted the day's events, each of us reflecting on the thin line between adventure and peril. The mountains had given us a stern reminder of their wildness, a lesson we would carry with us for the rest of our lives. Months later, the memory of that day still fresh in our minds, we planned another camping trip, this time to Jordan Lake in North Carolina. The lake was known for its serene beauty, and we looked forward to a peaceful retreat. We arrived at a secluded campsite, far from the main areas, eager to enjoy the tranquility. After a day spent boating and exploring, we set up 2 tents to accommodate the 4 of us. As dusk settled, we built a fire, its warm glow warding off the encroaching darkness. The chirping of crickets and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore provided a soothing soundtrack to our evening. As the fire dwindled and we prepared to retire for the night, a sudden thud against the side of our tent jolted us. We paused, listening intently. Another thud followed, then another. Probably just the other guys messing with us, I thought, chuckling. But then, from the other tent, our friends' voices rang out, laced with confusion and annoyance, demanding that we stop throwing rocks at them. A chill ran down my spine as the realization set in. We were not alone. We unzipped our tents cautiously, stepping into the cool night air. The moon cast an eerie glow over the campsite, but there was no sign of any intruders. The forest stood silent, as if holding its secrets close. Unease settled over us, but we tried to shake it off, gathering around the remnants of the fire to play cards, hoping to distract ourselves. Laughter came hesitantly, our ears attuned to every rustle and snap in the underbrush. Suddenly, another barrage of rocks pelted our tents, more forceful this time. We sprang to our feet, shining flashlights into the surrounding woods, but the beams illuminated nothing but trees and shadows. The stillness was unnerving, the absence of any identifiable source for the disturbance gnawing at our nerves. Determined to uncover the culprit, we ventured a few steps into the forest, calling out, but our voices were swallowed by the night. After a thorough but fruitless search, we retreated to our campsite, the weight of the unknown pressing heavily upon us. Eventually, the rock throwing ceased, leaving us with an unsettling silence. Exhaust. I was 5 years old when it happened. Too young to fully understand what I saw, but old enough to remember it vividly, even now. The memory has never faded. I still see it in my mind if I think about it for too long, and every time I do, that same feeling creeps back, the cold sweat, the way my stomach dropped, the tightness in my chest. I still don't have an explanation, and maybe I never will. It happened at my aunt's house. She lived in a 1-story home, a quiet place in a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual about it. I had been there plenty of times before. It always felt warm and comfortable, like most family houses do when you're a kid. But that evening changed everything. It was around 6 in the evening, still bright outside, the golden light of the setting sun pouring through the windows. I was there with my uncle and my older cousin. My aunt and the rest of the family weren't home, and the house felt quieter than usual. Not silent, but the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every little sound. The hum of the fridge, the occasional creak of the floor, the distant noise of a car passing outside. My little cousin, who was about a year and a half younger than me, had a crib in one of the back rooms of the house. The room itself was nothing special, just a regular bedroom, a bit darker than the rest of the house because the window was smaller and the curtains were always halfway drawn. But what made it stand out was the sheer number of stuffed animals in there. They were everywhere, lining the shelves, piled in the crib, scattered on the floor. Some were tiny, no bigger than my hand, and others were large, almost the size of a pillow. I had always liked stuffed animals. At that age, they were more than just toys. They had personalities. Some felt comforting, others felt strange. But they were always just toys, until that evening. I don't remember exactly what made me do it, but at some point, I climbed into the crib. Maybe I wanted to play, maybe I was just curious. The crib was big enough for me to sit in comfortably, and the mattress was soft. The stuffed animals surrounded me, their round plastic eyes staring blankly in all directions. I was digging through the pile, looking for something interesting to play with, when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. It was quick, just a flicker of motion, a stuffed animal shifting. At first, I thought it was my imagination, or maybe I had bumped into one and made it fall. But when I turned to look, nothing was out of place. Everything was exactly as it had been before. The toys sat still, lifeless, just as they should be. I frowned but didn't think too much about it. I went back to playing, pushing the thought away. Then I saw it, a donkey stuffed animal. I don't know why I hadn't noticed it before. It was gray, a little worn-looking, with dark eyes that were too glossy, almost like real eyes. And it was smiling. Not the stitched-on, cartoonish smile most stuffed animals have. No, this smile was wrong. It was twisted, stretched, almost human in a way I can't explain. It was pointing at me, and then it laughed. Not out loud, not like a person would, but I felt it laughing, saw the way its eyes crinkled, the way its expression shifted, like it was amused by me, by my fear. I froze. My body locked up completely, my breath stuck in my throat. My mind screamed at me to move, to get out of that crib, but I couldn't. It was like I had been swallowed by some invisible force, held in place, forced to see it. Then the scream ripped out of me. The moment I made a sound, the fear exploded. I scrambled to get out, kicking stuffed animals aside, my hands gripping the crib railing as I tried to climb over it. My body felt too small, too weak. The fear made everything feel heavy, like I was moving in slow motion. I don't know how long I screamed before my uncle and cousin came running. I barely registered them bursting into the room. Everything was a blur. My uncle grabbed me, lifted me up, carried me out of the room as I clung to him, my face buried in his shoulder. The living room was bright, open, safe. But I didn't feel safe. I was shaking, my chest heaving, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. My uncle sat me down on the couch, my cousin standing nearby, both of them watching me with concern. They kept asking me what was wrong, but I couldn't answer. My throat felt tight, my hands balled into fists, my whole body tense. I felt like if I spoke, it would somehow come back. I forced myself to breathe, to calm down. The shaking slowly stopped, my pulse slowing, my body remembering it was safe now. My uncle and cousin waited patiently, their expressions softening when they saw me relax a little. I finally managed to get the words out. I tried to explain what I had seen, that the donkey had moved, that it had laughed at me, that it had looked alive. But as soon as I started talking, something moved. I saw it. I know I saw it. Behind them, just over their shoulders, peeking between them. The donkey. Its head tilted slightly, its grin stretched wider, its eyes locked onto mine. I screamed again, pointing, trying to get them to see it, to look. My uncle and cousin spun around, searching the space behind them, but by the time their eyes landed where I was pointing, it was gone. There was nothing there. I refused to stay in that house after that. I refused to go back into that room. I don't remember what happened to that stuffed animal, if it was thrown away or if it just disappeared on its own. I never saw it again, but I never forgot. Even now, as an adult, I can picture it perfectly. The way it looked at me, the way it smiled, the way it laughed. I know what people would say, that I was just a kid, that my imagination got the better of me. That fear does strange things to the mind. I've told myself that too, but no matter how many times I try to rationalize it, no matter how much time has passed, I know what I saw. It was late, but not too late. Maybe a little past 10. The streets weren't completely empty, but they weren't busy either. It was that weird in-between time when most people were home, winding down, but there were still a few stragglers, people leaving work, some teenagers hanging around, maybe a couple of night owls taking a walk. The streetlights buzzed above, flickering in that dull yellow glow that never felt quite bright enough. She had taken this walk home 100 times before. 7 blocks from the train station to our neighborhood, a straight shot down a couple of main streets, turn a corner, and then she was home. Simple. Nothing unusual about it. But tonight, something felt different. It started as just a feeling. Nothing too strong at first, just that weird sensation that someone was behind her. She didn't think much of it. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe she was just tired. She had her bag slung over one shoulder, phone in her hand, earphones in, music playing softly. The usual routine. But something in her gut made her glance back. A man, a little ways behind her, walking at a steady pace. Not too fast, not too slow. Just there. She turned her head back forward and kept walking. Okay, that's normal. People walk. People take the same routes. This was a main road, not some isolated alleyway. Nothing to freak out about. But then, after a block, something made her look again. Still there. Same pace. Same distance. That's when she started paying attention. She wasn't sure if he was following her. Maybe it was a coincidence. But she wasn't the type to ignore bad feelings. She crossed in the middle of the block, stepping quickly over the street. It wasn't a usual crosswalk, but the road was empty. She looked back. The man crossed, too. Same spot. Same way. Her stomach clenched. She didn't start running. Running would make it obvious. Instead, she picked up her pace, turned the next corner, and listened. Footsteps. Not running. Not rushing. Just steady. He turned, too. She was now half a block away from my place. Her mind was racing. What if she was just overreacting? What if she looked stupid for freaking out over nothing? But then another thought pushed through. What if she wasn't? That's when she called me. I usually don't answer my phone right away. Half the time, I ignore it, thinking I'll call back later. But this time, something made me hesitate. I don't know why, but I picked up. She wasn't explaining anything. Just talking low and fast, asking if I was home, asking if she could come over right now. Her voice was tight, but she didn't say why. I told her yes. I didn't usually wait at the door for her, either. Normally, I'd let her ring the bell, let her come up like she always did. But something made me stand there, holding the door open, staring down the block. Then I saw her. She was moving fast, not quite running, but almost. Her shoulders were tense, her head was slightly ducked. I saw her eyes dart toward me, and then she practically bolted up my steps. I think I'm being followed, she blurted out the second she stepped inside. She rushed past me, into the hallway, into safety. I was still outside. I didn't go in right away. I don't know why, but I stayed there, standing in my doorway, looking down the street. Then I saw him. The man. He walked up slowly. He didn't look rushed. He wasn't running. He wasn't out of breath. He wasn't panicking like someone who had just been chasing someone. He was just walking. He passed my house, but stopped at the one next door. He looked up at the porch. He glanced toward the backyard. He scanned the area, searching. He didn't see her anymore. Then, just like that, he turned around and walked back the way he came. I stood there for a long time, watching until he disappeared. My heart was pounding. She had been right. If she hadn't called me, if I hadn't answered, if I hadn't stood outside waiting, what would have happened? If she had tried to unlock her own door instead of running straight here? If she had fumbled with her keys for even a few seconds? Would he have grabbed her? Would she have screamed? Would anyone have heard? I stepped back inside and locked the door behind me. Neither of us spoke for a while. The weight of what had just happened settled in, thick and heavy. She had gotten away, but only just. I don't know what made me wake up that night. Maybe it was just one of those strange instincts, the kind people talk about, but can never explain. Maybe it was nothing at all. But when I did wake up, heart pounding for no reason, I realized something wasn't right. We were house sitting for my boyfriend's sister, staying in her small bungalow for the weekend while she was away. The house was simple and cozy, a single-story place with a backyard that stretched out behind it. It wasn't fenced in, just open space that led to a wooded area a few hundred feet away. Beyond that was a road, but at night it was nothing but darkness. It was the middle of winter, and everything outside was covered in thick, untouched snow. The cold had settled in deep, the kind of cold that makes everything feel quieter, more still. Inside, We had the heat on just enough to keep the bedroom warm, and we had curled up under thick blankets, exhausted from the day. I had been dreaming, something strange and vivid. In the dream, I could hear snow crunching underfoot, slow and deliberate. I couldn't see anything, just the sound over and over again. It was rhythmic, almost purposeful, like someone walking in circles. Then, something in me jerked awake. I lay there for a moment, heart racing, trying to figure out what had startled me. The dream had felt too real, too immediate. My mind was foggy, but I could still hear the sound. The snow, crunching. I turned my head toward the window, which faced the backyard. The glass was frosted over, but there was enough moonlight to see shadows outside. It took me a second to register what I was looking at. A person. Someone was standing in the snow, just outside the window. Not moving, just there. I felt my stomach drop, a sickening wave of dread washing over me. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to process what I was seeing. The figure wasn't right up against the window, but they were close, maybe 10 feet away. Just standing there in the cold, in the middle of the night. I forced myself to breathe as quietly as possible, my body frozen in place. The person wasn't facing the window directly. They were slightly turned, like they were listening for something. Then they moved. Not toward the house, not away from it. They just started pacing. Slow, measured steps back and forth in front of the window. Their feet sank into the snow with each step, the sound filling the silent night. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I wanted to scream. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who would be out here in the middle of the night, pacing outside a stranger's house in the freezing cold? I turned toward my boyfriend, lying beside me, his back to the window. I reached out and shook his shoulder, my fingers trembling. He groaned in half-sleep, barely stirring. "There's someone outside," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. He grumbled something, half asleep, brushing me off like I was overreacting. I shook him harder, but he just sighed and rolled over, burying his face in the pillow. I turned back toward the window. The person was still there, still pacing. I forced myself to stay still, to not move a muscle, hoping, praying they would leave. But they didn't. They just kept walking back and forth, the snow crunching beneath them. I don't know how long I lay there watching, but at some point, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I must have drifted off to sleep. The next morning, everything felt surreal. I told my boyfriend about it, but he just laughed it off. "Probably just a neighbor or something," he said. I wanted to believe that, but there were no other houses nearby. No reason for anyone to be wandering around in the snow at that hour. I tried to brush it off, telling myself maybe I had dreamed it, or maybe it was just an animal. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. That night, I couldn't shake the unease. We locked the doors and windows before going to bed, though I knew that wouldn't do much if someone really wanted to get in. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening for anything outside. At some point, exhaustion won again, and I drifted off. Then I woke up. Not from a dream this time. Something had pulled me from sleep, an awareness, a feeling. And then I heard it. Crunch, crunch. My whole body stiffened. The sound was back. My breath hitched as I turned my head slowly toward the window. The figure was there again, standing, watching. Then, my boyfriend stirred beside me. He shifted, then went still. A few seconds later, he bolted upright. He had heard it too. Before I could say anything, he threw the blankets off and jumped out of bed. My heart was pounding as he yanked on his shoes and grabbed his sister's dog, a large but strangely quiet mutt. He ran to the back door, unlocking it in one swift motion, the dog bounding after him. Before I could even stop him, he threw the door open and ran outside. The cold hit immediately, seeping into the house. I scrambled to the window, pressing my hands against the glass, watching. The moment my boyfriend stepped outside, the figure moved. They turned and ran. I could see their dark shape against the snow, sprinting toward the tree line, leaving deep footprints behind. My boyfriend and the dog chased after them, the dog finally barking, but the person was fast. Too fast. They disappeared into the woods. My boyfriend stopped at the edge of the trees, breathing heavily, the dog still barking into the darkness. I stood frozen at the window, staring at the footprints. They led from the trees to our window, and then back again. We called his sister the next morning, but she had no idea who it could have been. She had never had issues before, never seen anything suspicious. We checked the backyard in the daylight, following the footprints to the fence line where they disappeared into the trees. There were no other houses nearby. No roads. Just deep woods. The dog, who had stayed silent the first night, acted completely normal. It was almost like nothing had happened. That was the last night we stayed there. To this day, I don't know what they wanted. Maybe they were just watching. Maybe they were waiting. Maybe they were planning something. All I know is that my body knew before I did. Before my mind could process it. Before I could understand what was happening, something in me had sensed it. And that terrifies me more than anything. I had always preferred camping alone. There was something about being out in the wild, away from people, with nothing but the trees, the wind, and the distant sound of water trickling through the valleys that made me feel at peace. The Ozarks had always been one of my favorite places. The mountains were rugged, covered in thick forests, and mostly untouched. It was the kind of place where you could go for miles without seeing another person. That's exactly what I wanted. I had planned this trip for a while. My pack was light, my tent was small, and I carried just the essentials. I wasn't worried about safety. I had camped alone plenty of times before. I wasn't carrying a gun, just a small pocket knife, but that never really bothered me. Most of the time, the biggest danger in places like this was twisting an ankle on a rocky trail. I arrived at the top of the mountain sometime in the late afternoon. The gravel road leading up had been rough, barely more than a path carved into the side of the mountain. My car was the only one parked at the small pull-off where the trailhead started. It wasn't surprising. This was a remote spot, and it was a weekday. The sun was already low when I set up my camp. The trees were thick, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. The air was cool, even for late summer. I found a good spot to pitch my tent, just a little ways off the trail, hidden enough so I wouldn't be visible to anyone walking by. Not that I expected anyone to. Once I got my gear settled, I decided to explore a little. The Ozark Trail stretched out in both directions, winding through the mountains, crossing streams, and disappearing into the dense undergrowth. I didn't go far, just enough to get a feel for the area. The forest was thick and quiet, only the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the silence. By the time I got back to camp, the sky was turning orange and pink. I cooked a simple meal, just some dehydrated food I had brought with me, then sat by the fire as the last light faded from the sky. The stars were bright, scattered across the sky in a way you could never see in a city. I stayed up for a little while, just listening to the night sounds. The occasional hoot of an owl, the chirping of insects, the rustling of something small moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful. I climbed into my tent around 8:30, zipped myself in, and stretched out on my sleeping bag. The air was cool and still. My body was sore from hiking, and I fell asleep quickly. I don't know what woke me. At first, I wasn't even sure I was awake. My brain was still foggy, stuck somewhere between sleep and consciousness. But then I heard it, a sound that cut through the silence like a blade. Screaming. I sat up so fast I hit my head on the top of the tent. My heart was already pounding, my body reacting before my mind even caught up. The sound was raw, high-pitched, and desperate. Someone was screaming in the woods. It wasn't just yelling. It wasn't someone calling for a lost dog or shouting to a friend. These were screams, the kind of screams that made my skin crawl. Pure, unfiltered terror. It sounded like someone was being murdered. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was an animal? Some kind of wounded creature? But no. The more I listened, the more I knew this was human. The screams lasted for several minutes. Long, drawn-out wails, like someone was being torn apart. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. Silence. Not the normal kind of silence. This was something different. The woods felt dead. No insects, no wind, no movement. Just emptiness. I sat there, every muscle in my body tense. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. There was no cell service out here. No way to call for help. And I had nothing but a small pocket knife. I didn't know what to do. If someone was out there, hurt, lost, or in danger, I should do something. But every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay put, to keep quiet. I waited. 10 minutes. 15. Nothing. Then, slowly, the sounds of the forest started to return. A distant cricket. The rustling of leaves in the wind. It was like whatever had caused those screams had disappeared, and nature was creeping back in. I told myself it was over. Maybe it was just some drunk hiker who got lost and panicked. Maybe it was someone playing a prank. Maybe. I wasn't about to stay and find out. I made a decision. I was leaving. I moved carefully, keeping my breathing as quiet as possible. I started packing my gear slowly in the dark. I didn't use my headlamp. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. The last thing I wanted was for whoever, or whatever, was out there to see me. Halfway through packing, the screaming started again. I stopped cold. My fingers clenched around the fabric of my tent. This time, it was different. The voice was closer. And now, instead of just raw, mindless terror, there was something else. Help! The voice was desperate. It sounded like someone was running, crashing through the underbrush, barely able to breathe between their screams. Help me, please. It was coming straight toward me. I could hear the footsteps now, snapping branches, crunching leaves. Fast, wild, uncontrolled. I wasn't waiting anymore. I shoved the rest of my gear into my pack, not caring about organization. I had to go. I moved quickly but silently, slipping away from my campsite, deeper into the woods. I kept low, trying to move like a shadow. Every instinct told me to put as much distance between myself and that voice as possible. For the next hour, I crept through the darkness, weaving between trees, stepping carefully to avoid making noise. The voice kept calling out, fading, then growing louder again. I couldn't tell if it was moving in a straight line or circling. Then, I saw something. A light. Headlights, bouncing through the trees. A vehicle was coming up the mountain road. I made my way toward the gravel as fast as I could without breaking into a run. As I got closer, I saw it was a police vehicle, a sheriff's deputy. Relief flooded my body, but I didn't let my guard down. I moved cautiously, making sure they saw me before I stepped into the open. It turned out the authorities were already looking for someone. A man, high on something, had freaked out at a local ranch, screaming that he was lost before running into the woods. The sheriff's department and forest rangers had been searching for him. Eventually, they found him. I didn't stick around to watch. I was done. I waited for daylight, my body still buzzing with adrenaline. As soon as the sun rose, I packed the rest of my things and hiked out. By the time I reached my car, the morning was bright, the woods peaceful again, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew what I had heard, and I knew that, for a few hours that night, I wasn't alone in the Ozarks. Spring break of 2019 was a time I had eagerly anticipated. Our school had organized a trip to London and Edinburgh, Scotland, offering us a chance to immerse ourselves in the rich history and culture of these iconic cities. Little did I know that this journey would etch an indelible memory into my mind, one that would haunt me for years to come. Our itinerary was packed with visits to museums, historical landmarks, and cultural sites. However, amidst the structured schedule, a particular activity piqued our collective interest: a ghost tour in Edinburgh known as the Mercat Tour. The prospect of exploring haunted sites and delving into the city's darker history was irresistible to a group of curious teenagers. The tour commenced above ground, winding through the heart of Edinburgh. Our guide, a charismatic storyteller, painted vivid pictures of the city's past. He described the medieval sanitation practices, where residents would dispose of waste by tossing it from their windows, leading to the creation of channels along the streets to manage the flow of refuse. He also recounted the grim public spectacles of torture and execution that once served as macabre entertainment for the masses. These tales, though gruesome, were fascinating and provided a visceral connection to the past. As we meandered through the cobblestone streets, the guide led us to an unassuming facade, a stack of apartments and shops that concealed the entrance to the underground world beneath Edinburgh. This was where the tour took a thrilling turn. The Blair Street Underground Vaults, to which only this tour company had exclusive access, awaited us. Constructed in 1788, the South Bridge was supported by 19 arches. To maximize space in the burgeoning city, buildings were erected on either side of these arches, creating rooms between them. Initially intended for storage and workshops, these vaults quickly devolved into a haven for illicit activities. Gangs utilized the spaces for gambling, prostitution, and other nefarious dealings. The conditions were squalid, and the vaults became synonymous with crime and poverty. By the mid-19th century, the police intervened, evacuating the occupants and filling the vaults with rubble to prevent further misuse. The vaults lay forgotten until 1985, when a local shop owner renovating his property stumbled upon a hidden staircase leading to the buried chambers. Over the years, these vaults were excavated and opened to the public, offering a glimpse into a shadowy chapter of Edinburgh's history. Descending into the vaults was akin to stepping back in time. The air grew cooler and more humid, carrying a musty scent that hinted at centuries of neglect. The dim lighting cast elongated shadows on the stone walls, enhancing the eerie atmosphere. Our guide led us through a labyrinth of chambers, each with its own sordid tale. He spoke of the impoverished souls who sought refuge in these dark spaces, and the criminals who exploited them. The walls seemed to whisper the secrets of those who had once inhabited these depths. One particular chamber stood out, a room notorious for its haunting reputation. As we crossed its threshold, an almost palpable chill enveloped us. The guide explained that this was considered the most haunted room in the vaults, with numerous reports of unexplained phenomena. The oppressive atmosphere was undeniable, and even the skeptics among us exchanged uneasy glances. As the tour concluded, a sense of relief washed over me. The underground world, with its heavy history and lingering spirits, was behind us. We began our ascent via a narrow spiral staircase, the kind that seemed to tighten with each step. The staircase had small landings between flights, one of which featured a narrow, empty hallway extending about 9 feet, ending at a door with a noticeable 1-foot gap between the top of the door and the frame. It was on this staircase that my encounter occurred. As I ascended, an inexplicable urge compelled me to glance back toward the door at the end of the hallway. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, as if materializing from the very shadows, a figure appeared. He was tall and stout, with a round face adorned by rosy cheeks reminiscent of a jolly character from folklore. A light brown mustache and goatee framed his face, but it was his eyes that ensnared me. They were unlike any I had ever seen. White sclera contrasted by pupils and irises as black as coal, exuding an unsettling gleam. For what felt like an eternity, though it was mere seconds, I stood frozen, my gaze locked with his. My breath caught in my throat, and a cold sweat prickled my skin. The figure remained motionless, his dark eyes boring into mine, conveying an emotion I couldn't decipher. Panic surged through me, breaking the trance. I tore my eyes away and bolted up the remaining steps, my heart pounding erratically. Bursting into the room where the rest of the group had gathered, I collapsed against a wall, gasping for air. Tears blurred my vision as I struggled to articulate what I had witnessed. Fumbling with my smartwatch, I noted that my heart rate had skyrocketed from a resting 100 BPM to 149 BPM in a matter of moments. The physiological evidence of my terror was undeniable. In the days that followed, I grappled with the reality of what I had seen. Had my mind conjured the apparition, influenced by the chilling tales and the oppressive environment? Or had I truly glimpsed a specter from Edinburgh's past? The rational part of me sought logical explanations, perhaps a trick of the light or an overactive imagination. Yet, the vividness of the encounter and the visceral fear it evoked suggested otherwise. Years have passed since that fateful night, but the memory remains as clear as ever. Even now, recounting the experience sends a shiver down my spine. While I may never fully comprehend what I saw in the depths of the Blair Street underground vaults, the encounter has left an indelible mark on me, a reminder of the mysteries that linger just beyond the veil of our understanding. I come from a small town in Ireland where not much ever happens. It's the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, where you know your neighbors by name, and where crime is something you hear about on the news, but never really expect to see outside your own front door. Our town is quiet, and the town next to it, an even smaller, sleepier place, is even quieter. Or at least it was. In 2014, something happened there that changed everything. People still talk about it sometimes, always in hushed voices, as if saying too much might summon the memory back into something real again. Different people tell it in different ways, but this is the version I know. It happened one morning, early enough that most people were still having their breakfast, drinking tea, reading the paper. The town, as usual, was still and uneventful. But inside one house, a horror was unfolding. A man, his name isn't important, but everyone around here knows it, had decided that today was the day. His parents were in their 70s, both well-liked in the community. The father had been a maths teacher, the mother a nurse. My own father had worked with her before, and had nothing but good things to say. Lovely couple, he used to say, shaking his head when the topic came up. Didn't deserve that. The son thought differently. No one knows the exact moment it began, what was running through his head when he picked up the hatchet, how long he had been thinking about it before he finally did it. What we do know is that when it was over, the house was locked, and he was gone. The details are murky. Some say a group of builders found the bodies first. Others say it was his brother who came looking, knocking on the door and getting no answer. He knew they were home. They had nowhere to be, and they weren't the type to just leave without telling someone. When they didn't answer, he tried the door, but it was locked. The kitchen window was open. He climbed in. There are things no one should ever have to see. The bodies were unrecognizable. Blood covered the walls, the floors, the furniture. There were multiple wounds, too many to count. The blows had been frenzied, uncontrolled. It wasn't just an act of killing, it was overkill. A crime of pure madness. The worst part, the heads. Some people say they were nearly severed, hanging by scraps of skin. Others say they were fully detached. Either way, it wasn't a clean murder. It was messy, chaotic, brutal. And then there was the silence. Not the silence of an empty house, but the silence that comes after something terrible, something so wrong that the air itself feels different. Whoever found them first, whether it was the builders or the brother, couldn't have processed it right away. How could you? There's no way to prepare for something like that. At some point, the guards were called. Word spread fast. It always does in places like this. But the killer was gone. No one saw where he went at first. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. But he hadn't. He had gone straight to his brother's engineering company. When he arrived, he didn't make a scene. He didn't run in, didn't scream or cry. He just walked up to an employee, took out his wallet, and handed it over. "I won't be needing that," he said. And then he left. No one knew what to make of it at the time. It was a strange thing to do, sure, but no one immediately suspected what had happened. Not until later, when the truth came out, when everyone realized that those words, so casual, so matter-of-fact, had come from a man who had just butchered his own parents. The manhunt didn't last long. They found him eventually, wandering. Maybe he had nowhere to go. Maybe he thought he had done what he needed to do and didn't care what happened next. They arrested him without much struggle. He didn't fight, didn't try to run. It was over. And then came the trial. The courtroom was packed. People wanted answers. They wanted to know why. But the answers didn't make sense. The killer wasn't some cold-blooded murderer, not in the traditional sense. He was sick. That's what the defense said. And as much as people hated to admit it, they were right. Paranoid schizophrenia. It turned out he had been unraveling for a long time. He believed his mother was poisoning him. He thought people were conspiring against him. He was convinced that aliens were coming to take him into the Matrix, that the IRA was trying to recruit him. And then there was the voice. The night before the murders, he swore he had heard his mother telling him to do it. Not just his mother's voice, but something behind it, something bigger. He believed he was helping them, that by killing them, he was sending them to heaven. When you hear that, it's hard to know what to feel. Hatred? Pity? Fear? Some people say it was just an excuse, that he knew exactly what he was doing. Others say he had been failed, that he should have been treated long before it got to this point. Whatever the case, he was found not guilty of murder by reason of insanity. He didn't go to prison. He went to the Central Mental Hospital in Dublin, where he remains to this day. The town never really recovered. How could it? Even now, years later, people still talk about it. They shake their heads, lower their voices, glance over their shoulders. The house where it happened is still there. Some say no one wants to live in it. Others say it was bought and renovated, that a new family lives there now, trying to make it into something normal again. But you can't scrub away something like that. And the brother, the one who found them, how do you live after something like that? How do you sleep at night? How do you walk past the place where it happened without feeling sick? No one really knows. People moved on, as they always do. Life went back to normal, or at least as normal as it could be. But there's something about it, something about knowing that things like this can happen, even in a quiet town, even in a peaceful home. Because after that, the doors stayed locked, and they haven't been unlocked since. It had been a long shift. I was ready to go home, take off my shoes, and collapse onto my bed. The roads were empty, as they always were this time of night. Out here, In the deep stretches of Arkansas hills, everything was quiet after dark. A few porch lights flickered in the distance, and the occasional truck would rumble past. But for the most part, it was just me, my car, and the long, winding roads leading home. The air was thick and humid, the kind of night where everything sticks to your skin. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the two-lane highway in front of me. The bridge was coming up, a short one, nothing special, just a small pass over a creek. Beyond it, the road curved uphill, disappearing into the thick trees that lined both sides. That's when I saw them. A car sat on the opposite side of the road, hazard lights flashing, parked just before the curve. The bright, rhythmic blinks reflected against the pavement. I slowed down, instinctively scanning the area. In a place like this, you always stop. It wasn't like the city, where you kept driving and minded your own business. Out here, if someone was pulled over, you helped. That was just the way it was. As I eased my car to the side of the road and rolled to a stop, I caught sight of something else. Further down the hill, beyond the trees, was a glow. A bright, orange flickering glow. My stomach clenched. Fire. I shut off my car, leaving my headlights on, and stepped out. The smell hit me first. Burning wood, rubber, something acrid and thick. Smoke curled up into the night sky. I looked back toward the first car, the one with the hazards, and recognized it immediately. It was my LPN's car. She was standing nearby, watching the fire below. The truck was almost fully engulfed, flames licking up into the night, casting wild shadows against the trees. I didn't need to ask what had happened. The tire marks on the pavement told the story. A truck had lost control on the curve, gone off the side, and crashed down into the woods. It had caught fire, and now there was no way to get close. I swallowed hard, stepping forward. The heat radiated even from here, waves of it distorting the air. The flames roared, consuming everything. There was no movement, no screams, no sign of life. Whoever had been inside, they weren't getting out. I glanced at my LPN. She had been here for a while. 15 minutes, she said. Waiting. 15 minutes. I checked my phone. It had been at least another 10 since I arrived. Almost half an hour, and still no sirens. No flashing red and blue lights. I exhaled sharply, trying to push down the growing unease in my gut. We weren't that far from town. The hospital, the fire station, the police department, they were all 7, maybe 8 minutes away at most. Even at this hour, the roads were empty. No traffic. No reason for this kind of delay. I looked back at the fire. The metal groaned as the heat warped it, the occasional pop of something inside bursting from the pressure. It was beyond saving. There was no getting near it. We stood there, watching, waiting. It felt endless. The smell of burning oil and flesh made my stomach turn, but I stayed. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because I couldn't look away. Maybe because it felt wrong to leave. Eventually, the sound of sirens cut through the silence. A long, wailing cry, faint at first, growing louder. The first red and white lights appeared at the top of the hill, flashing against the trees. It had been nearly an hour since the crash. The fire department arrived first, pulling to a stop near the bridge. Firefighters rushed out, dragging hoses, shouting commands, their movements quick and practiced. Water blasted from the hoses, hitting the flames with a sharp hiss, steam billowing into the air. The blaze fought back at first, but eventually the flames shrank, reduced to embers, then smoldering blackened metal. The heat faded. The night air grew still again. When they finally moved in to check the wreckage, I already knew what they'd find. Or rather, what they wouldn't. There was nothing left. The body inside had been burned beyond recognition. What remained was barely more than charred bone, some fragments of fabric, and teeth. Teeth. I turned away, swallowing against the bile rising in my throat. Then, the realization hit me like a fist to the gut. The truck. I knew that truck. I had just seen it that morning, parked outside the gas station, and I knew who had been driving it. A friend. Someone I'd known for years. I felt lightheaded, the edges of my vision narrowing. My hands shook, and I clenched them into fists. It didn't feel real, but it was. A sick, hollow feeling settled in my chest. I stood there for a long time, watching as the firefighters continued their work, as the police finally arrived and began marking off the area, as the night slowly returned to the quiet it had before. The road was empty again. The curve, the bridge, the embankment, nothing looked different. But I knew. I got back in my car, gripping the steering wheel tight. The heat of the fire still clung to my clothes, the smell of smoke thick in my hair. I stared at the road ahead. An hour. It had taken them an hour to get here. 7 minutes away. And it took an hour. I turned the key. My headlights cut through the dark. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and silent. And I drove home. The first time was a disaster. My aunt liked to take us on birthday adventures, something special instead of just a wrapped present. Some families went to amusement parks or the movies, but for us, it was always supposed to be camping. The plan was simple. Get out into the woods, sleep under the stars, cook over an open fire, and make some memories. Except we never seemed to get it right. The first year, I broke my collarbone a week before the trip. I don't even remember exactly how. I think I tripped over a tree root in the backyard and went down hard. What I do remember is how bad it hurt. No way was I going to be rolling around in a sleeping bag on the ground. My aunt called it off before we even left, promising we'd go next year. The next year was the worst. It was somewhere in northern Illinois, Starved Rock, if I had to guess. We took my aunt's Jeep Wrangler, the kind with no top and no doors, just open air and packed to the brim with camping gear. Everything was crammed in. Sleeping bags, firewood, a cooler, a tent, and a bunch of random junk we probably didn't need. I remember sitting in the back, my legs wedged between bags, my hair whipping in the wind as we drove down the highway. It felt like an adventure, even before we got to the campsite. When we arrived, we set up camp near the tree line, not far from the designated fire pits. We pitched the tent, got the fire going, and cooked a simple dinner. Hot dogs, beans, nothing fancy. It was a warm summer evening, the sky clear and full of stars. After we ate, my aunt pulled out a pack of Jiffy Pop. Have you ever tried making Jiffy Pop on a campfire? It's a disaster waiting to happen. Even on a gas stove, I can't seem to get it right. Over an open flame, it was even worse. We shook the pan, waiting for the popping to start, but it just burned. The smell of scorched popcorn filled the air. When we finally gave up, we tossed the whole thing into the garbage bag, hanging off the side of the Jeep. With the fire crackling and the burnt popcorn forgotten, we told scary stories until we got tired. Eventually, the flames burned low, and we crawled into our sleeping bags. The forest was quiet except for the usual nighttime sounds: crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I don't know how long I was asleep before my aunt shook me awake. She whispered, "Do you hear that?" At first, I didn't. I lay still, my brain foggy from sleep. Then I heard it, something big moving outside the tent. Rustling, heavy footsteps, the sound of something brushing against the fabric of the tent itself. My heart started pounding. More noises joined in, screeching, hissing, chattering. It wasn't just one thing. It was a group, and whatever they were right outside the tent. The zipper trembled. I lay there, frozen, barely breathing. My aunt grabbed her phone and started dialing. I could hear the beeps of the keypad as she called for help. The noise outside got louder, more frantic. Claws scraped against the fabric. A low, guttural growl cut through the chaos. Something slammed into the tent, making the whole thing shake. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. We stayed curled up in the tent, listening to the chaos outside. It felt like it went on forever. The sounds moved around us, rustling, thumping, more chattering. The Jeep creaked. Something was climbing onto it. Then, finally, headlights. A car pulled up fast, gravel crunching under its tires. The noise outside didn't stop immediately. The car door slammed. A flashlight beam cut through the trees. A man's voice shouted, angry loud. Then whack. Something screamed. The light moved erratically, bouncing around as the man swung at something again. More yelling. Another whack. Then silence. The man called out, telling us it was safe. When we crawled out of the tent, we saw the damage. The garbage bag had been torn open, and the Jiffy Pop was everywhere. Burnt popcorn scattered across the Jeep's seats, the dashboard, the ground. The seats had small rips in them. The rubber stripping around the doors was chewed up. Paw prints covered the hood. Raccoons. Not just one or two, an entire pack of them. The ranger stood there with his flashlight, shaking his head. He told us these raccoons weren't scared of anything. He had to beat them off with his flashlight, literally. By then, there was no going back to sleep. We broke camp at 4 a.m, tossing everything into the Jeep in a hurry. The tent, still half standing, was shoved in without even rolling it up. We used the cooler to hold it down. The drive home was miserable, cold air whipping through the topless Jeep, the scent of burnt popcorn lingering. But we were determined. The next year, we tried again. And for the most part, it went fine. The weather was good, the tent stayed up, and nothing attacked us in the night. It almost felt like a victory. Then we stopped at Denny's on the way home. 2 minutes after sitting down, the fire alarm went off. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal, just a kitchen mistake. But then the alarm wouldn't stop. The staff ran around, trying to figure out how to shut it off. The fire department showed up. No one had the key to access the alarm system. We never even got our food. By then, it felt like the universe was telling us something. We haven't gone camping together since. It started as a quiet night. I was home alone with my little brothers, just the three of us in the house. My father and my bonus mother had gone out for a few hours, leaving me in charge. My brothers are only 4, so it wasn't a difficult task. They were excited to spend time with me, and we had a nice evening together. We ate candy, watched some cartoons, and played around the house. They got tired around 10 p.m., and I tucked them into bed in my room, making sure they were comfortable before stepping out to let them sleep. With them asleep, I finally had some time to myself. I grabbed my phone, scrolled through random things, and just relaxed. The house was quiet, except for the usual creaks and groans that any home makes late at night. It was nothing unusual, just the house settling, or maybe the wind outside shifting the wooden beams. I was used to those small sounds. Then, around 11:30 p.m., I heard it. A smash. Not like something small falling over. It was deep, loud, and heavy, like a vase hitting the ground, but without the sharp crack of breaking glass. Just a thud, like something solid hitting the floor hard. My heart jumped. I froze for a moment, trying to process what I just heard. It had come from upstairs. My brothers were sleeping upstairs. I got up fast and ran up the stairs, my breath already coming quicker. The sound had been loud enough that I expected to find something obvious. A knocked-over chair, something on the floor. Maybe one of my brothers had fallen out of bed. But when I reached my room and turned on the light, everything was exactly as I had left it. The boys were still in bed, curled up under their blankets. Neither of them had moved. Nothing was on the floor. Nothing was broken. I looked around, checked under the bed, checked the corners of the room. Nothing. Still, the sound had definitely come from upstairs. I moved to the hallway and looked into the other rooms on the second floor, expecting to find something knocked over. But as I checked each room, I found nothing. Everything was in its place. It made no sense. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was something from outside. I told myself it could have been something shifting in the walls or a random noise from the street. Even though I knew what I had heard, I forced myself to brush it off. I went back downstairs, a little uneasy but still trying to stay calm. About an hour later, around 12:30 a.m., it happened again. Boom. Another heavy smash, exactly like the first one. I jumped up, my chest tightening with adrenaline. I ran upstairs again, this time faster. I expected to see something on the floor, expected to find a source for the noise. Again, nothing. But this time, one of my brothers woke up. He sat up groggily, rubbing his eyes. He mumbled something about not being able to sleep, and, without saying much else, climbed out of bed and followed me downstairs. I let him sit with me while I watched TV, trying to distract myself from how unnerved I was. My heart was still racing. I didn't want to scare my little brother, so I acted normal, but my mind was going in circles, trying to make sense of the noises. Then, around 1 a.m., it happened again. This time it was even louder. The whole house shook with the impact. My other brother woke up from the noise and immediately started crying. Now I was officially panicked. 3 times. There was no way I was imagining this. Something was making those noises. I called my father and my bonus mother. My voice was shaking as I told them what was happening. They told me it was probably nothing, just the house making sounds, maybe something falling over. But I could tell in their voices that they were uncertain too. Still, I wasn't going to sit there doing nothing. I grabbed my phone and my PC and set them to record, one with video and one with audio. If something made that noise again, I was going to catch it. I sat there, tense, waiting. My brothers were still awake now, sitting with me. I kept the lights on, feeling safer that way. Then, maybe 20 minutes later, it happened again. Boom. I caught it. I looked at the recordings, my hands shaking. The audio had clearly picked up the exact deep, solid smash I'd been hearing all night. There was no mistaking it. It was real. I called my father again, my voice more urgent this time. I sent him the recording. When they listened, I heard the shift in their tone. Now they were panicked too. They told me to stay put while they rushed home. We all sat there, frozen, waiting. The house was silent again, but every second felt stretched. Every small creak made my skin crawl. When my father and bonus mother finally arrived, they immediately began searching. We moved through the house, checking every room again. Then, as we stood in the hallway, another smash echoed through the house. It came from above us, the attic. My father and I exchanged a look. The attic door was a small, square opening in the ceiling with a pull-down ladder. It was usually locked, but something was up there. We had no choice. We had to check. My father grabbed a flashlight, and I stood behind him as he pulled down the attic ladder. The old wood creaked as he climbed up. The air smelled stale, thick with dust. I held my breath as he pointed the flashlight around. Then, **movement***. A dark shape, shifting in the shadows. And then suddenly it lunged. My father stumbled back as something darted toward him. **, a person **. They were small, almost hunched over, their body painted black. Their clothes were torn, their hair was messy, and their eyes were wide and wild. Before we could react, they grabbed something, a vase, and threw it. It hit my bonus mother, knocking her back. My father screamed, "The children!" I turned and ran. I grabbed my little brothers, snatched the garage key, and pulled them with me. My heart was hammering in my chest as I unlocked the garage door, shoved them inside, and locked us in. I turned on the lights and told them to stay quiet. I told them to hide. I promised them everything was going to be okay, even though I wasn't sure myself. For 2 hours, we stayed there. Outside, I heard footsteps. I heard shouts. I heard another smash. Then, finally, sirens. When I heard them, I knew it was over. I told my brothers to stay hidden until I said the code word, birthday cake. Then, I carefully stepped out of the garage. The police were there. The ambulance was there. My bonus mother was being treated for a cut on her head, and my father was talking to the officers. The person, the thing that had been in our attic, was handcuffed in the back of a police car. Apparently, they had been living up there, hidden away, for who knows how long. They had been breaking things, destroying things, rummaging through the attic. The police weren't sure what they wanted, or how they had even gotten in. That night, I barely slept. Even after everything was over, I kept hearing noises in my head, kept thinking every small sound was another smash. Even now, I still have trouble sleeping, because for weeks, maybe longer, someone had been right above us, hiding, listening, and we never even knew. Camping was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. That was the whole reason we planned the trip, to escape the noise of the city, to breathe fresh air, to spend a few nights under the open sky. We weren't deep in the wilderness, just in the countryside, far enough from town to feel secluded, but not so remote that we couldn't hear distant traffic if we really listened. The campsite was a simple clearing with a few trees around, and there were others camping nearby when we arrived. It wasn't complete isolation, which gave us some comfort. We got there in the late afternoon, around 4. The sun was still bright, filtering through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Setting up camp took a bit longer than we expected. Not because we were unprepared, but because we had gone all out with our gear. We had professional-grade tents, high-end sleeping bags, a quality fire pit, and even a cooler stocked with food that would have lasted us days. We weren't exactly survivalists roughing it in the wild. We were city people who had invested in the best equipment to make the experience comfortable. By the time we finished setting up, we took a look around the site. It was peaceful. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dry grass and earth, a stark contrast to the city's exhaust fumes and concrete. The sun hung low in the sky, painting everything in a warm, golden hue. The last of the neighboring campers were starting to pack up. Around 6, they left, driving off down the dirt road that led back toward civilization. For a while, it was exactly what we wanted, calm, quiet, untouched. It felt like we had found our own little world, away from everything. But then, the laughter started. At first, it was faint, almost easy to dismiss. It sounded like kids, giggling in the distance, the kind of playful laughter you'd hear at a park or a schoolyard. We assumed it was some local kids who lived nearby, maybe making fun of us for being overprepared with all our gear. It wasn't unreasonable. We had spent a fortune on equipment that the average country dweller probably would have laughed at. But as the minutes passed, we realized something was off about the laughter. It came in bursts, short, sudden, and scattered. It wasn't the casual, carefree laughter of kids playing. It was strange, too frequent, too erratic. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just echoes, the way sound travels differently in open spaces. Maybe there was a group of kids somewhere in the distance, running through the fields, their voices carrying on the wind. That had to be it. The sun dipped below the horizon around 8. The darkness settled in quickly, heavy and absolute. No moonlight, no distant glow from streetlights or houses. Just blackness pressing in from all sides, the only relief being the flickering glow of our campfire. And that's when the laughter changed. It was closer now, no longer distant. It surrounded us, coming from different directions, cutting through the night with an unnatural sharpness. It wasn't just laughter anymore either. There were odd noises mixed in, sounds I couldn't quite place. The firelight only illuminated so far, leaving the edges of the clearing veiled in darkness. We peered into the blackness, straining to see beyond the flickering light. Then, all at once, they appeared. Glowing eyes. Dozens of them. Yellow, glinting in the firelight, scattered in a rough circle around us. Some were lower to the ground, others slightly higher. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was just eyes, unmoving, staring at us from the shadows. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a series of eerie, guttural noises, chitters, growls, strange high-pitched calls. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. These weren't kids. Hyenas. The laughing we had been hearing wasn't human at all. It had been them the entire time. I felt my stomach drop as my mind connected the pieces. Hyenas weren't supposed to be in this area. They were animals I associated with documentaries, with Africa, not the countryside where we were camping. But there they were, 20 maybe more, their bodies hidden in the dark, only their eyes and voices betraying their presence. For a moment, none of us moved. A primal kind of fear settled over me, the kind that goes beyond logic, beyond reason. It was the kind of fear that told you, instinctively, that you were being hunted. The fire was our only defense. We scrambled to throw more wood on it, feeding the flames, making them leap higher into the night. The fire cracked and roared, sending glowing embers swirling into the darkness. The hyenas didn't scatter immediately. They hesitated, shifting slightly, their eyes narrowing against the sudden brightness. I could hear them breathing, could hear the soft rustling as they moved in the tall grass, circling, assessing. That was the worst part, the way they didn't charge, didn't attack outright. They were testing us. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, an axe we had brought for chopping firewood. Others grabbed knives, heavy flashlights, anything with weight. One of us made a dash for the car. The moment the headlights flared on, the effect was immediate. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the hyenas properly for the first time. They were big, bigger than I had imagined. Their bodies were hunched, muscular, covered in coarse fur. Their faces were wide, their jaws powerful, their ears twitching as they gauged the threat. The car's horn blared, breaking the silence with a sharp, jarring blast. That did it. The hyenas flinched then, almost as one, turned and melted back into the shadows. They didn't run in a panic, didn't scatter like startled deer. They simply faded away, slipping silently back into the darkness beyond the reach of our firelight. And just like that, they were gone. For a long time, none of us spoke. The fire still burned strong, the headlights still cut into the blackness, but there was nothing out there anymore. Just empty space where moments ago we had been surrounded. We didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We kept the fire roaring, kept the lights on, kept our weapons close. Every rustling leaf, every distant call of an animal sent a fresh wave of tension through us. By morning, it was almost easy to doubt what had happened. The clearing looked the same as it had the night before, just an empty patch of land with a few scattered footprints in the dirt. But we knew. We packed up quickly, checking the ground, making sure there were no signs that they were still around. The moment everything was loaded into the cars, we left, driving away with a silent agreement that we weren't coming back. I still think about that night sometimes, about the laughter, about the glowing eyes, and about the way they just stood there, waiting. I was 16 when it happened. Looking back now, I know exactly how stupid I was, but at the time, it didn't feel like a mistake. It just felt like something I had to do to get home. I lived in a rural part of Maine, the kind of place where streetlights didn't exist, and the only thing lighting up the roads at night were the high beams of a car or, if you were lucky, a bright moon. It wasn't like the movies where towns had gas stations open 24/7 or convenience stores with flickering neon signs. If you ran out of gas in the middle of the night, you were pretty much screwed unless you had someone to call. But at 2 in the morning, I didn't have anyone. My job at a small restaurant kept me late most nights, especially on weekends. I'd finish up around 1 a.m., lock the place up if I was closing, and then start my 45-minute drive home on dark, winding roads. It wasn't ideal, but I was used to it. The drive had become routine. I knew the turns, the spots where deer tended to cross, and the long stretches where I wouldn't see another car for miles. That night, my car was in the shop, so I had taken my dad's truck. I hadn't thought to check the gas gauge when I left work. I just wanted to get home. I was exhausted, my head filled with the sounds of clanking dishes and the hum of the kitchen's industrial fan. I was halfway home when the truck sputtered and coughed before slowing to a stop. I sat there for a moment in the cab, my hands still on the wheel, willing it to start again. It didn't. I turned the key a few more times, but all I got was the clicking sound of a dead engine. I glanced at the gas gauge and realized my mistake. The needle was below empty. For a second, I just sat there, staring out at the empty road. There were no houses nearby, no sign of life. The trees on either side of the road loomed tall and dark, stretching up toward the sky. The only sound was the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional rustling of something in the woods. I had no choice. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, stepped out of the truck, and started walking. The road was long and empty, nothing but pavement and trees for miles. The only thing keeping me company was the sound of my own footsteps and the beam of my flashlight bouncing with every step. I wasn't scared, not yet. It was just inconvenient. I figured I'd have to walk a couple of miles before I found a house or a gas station, and even though I wasn't thrilled about it, I knew I could do it. That was when I heard the car coming. At first, it was just a distant rumble, barely audible over the sounds of the forest. But as it got closer, I turned to see headlights cutting through the darkness. I stepped to the side of the road, waving my flashlight slightly, hoping the driver would stop. I figured it would be some old farmer, or maybe one of the guys from town. Someone normal. The car slowed as it approached me, then pulled off to the shoulder with a slight crunch of gravel. It was an old station wagon, the kind you didn't see much anymore. The headlights were yellowed, and the paint was faded. The passenger side window rolled down with a mechanical whine, and I saw the driver's face in the dim light. I should have trusted my gut. The guy was older, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, with thinning hair and thick glasses that reflected the glow of the dashboard lights. His face was round and sweaty, his lips chapped. Something about him was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I told him I had run out of gas, and he nodded slowly before gesturing for me to get in. I was 16. I was tired. I wasn't thinking. I climbed into the passenger seat and closed the door. The second I did, I heard the click of the power locks. That was when the fear hit me. I looked around the car, my breath catching in my throat. The inside was a mess. Not just messy, but hoarder-level messy. Fast food wrappers, empty soda bottles, old newspapers stacked on the dashboard. The back seat was completely filled with random junk, clothes, plastic bags, piles of God knows what. There was barely any room for me in the front seat. And then I looked at him again. His fingers tapped on the steering wheel as he stared ahead, his tongue darting out to wet his cracked lips. The smile he had given me earlier was gone. His face was blank, unreadable. I realized then that I had made a mistake. A big one. The car started rolling forward, the engine humming softly. My mind raced, trying to come up with something, anything to get me out of the situation. Then, out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights filled the car. A police car. The guy's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles turning white. I didn't hesitate. I blurted out that I didn't need a ride anymore, that I was fine, that he could let me out. To my surprise, he did. He reached over and unlocked the door. My hand shot out, grabbing the handle, and I shoved the door open before practically tumbling onto the pavement. I ran toward the police car without looking back. The station wagon didn't stick around. The second I was out, the driver gunned it, the tires kicking up gravel as he sped off into the night. The cop wasn't actually a cop, it was a game warden. He thought we had been poaching deer at night. He gave me a hard time about getting into a stranger's car, then called a tow truck to bring me gas. I never told my parents what happened. A year later, I saw the man's face again on the news. He had been arrested in Texas after murdering multiple women. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. That was him, the same man, the same thick glasses, the same thinning hair. I could have been one of them. I could have been dead. I sat there in my living room, the sound of the news anchor's voice fading into the background. My hands felt cold, even though the house was warm. My chest felt tight. I thought about the night I ran out of gas, about the click of the power locks, about the way his fingers tapped on the steering wheel. I thought about how lucky I was. And then I thought about the women who weren't. Hiking the Narrows had been on my list for years. The idea of walking through a winding slot canyon, surrounded by towering rock walls and wading through the Virgin River, was something I had always wanted to experience. When my friends and I finally planned the trip, I was excited but also a little wary. I had read enough to know that flash floods were a serious risk. The canyon walls were steep and narrow, and if the water rose too quickly, there was nowhere to go. We arrived at the trailhead early in the morning. The sky was overcast, a heavy layer of gray stretching across the sky. It wasn't raining yet, but it felt like it could at any moment. A sign at the entrance warned about the possibility of flash floods. There had been some rain in the forecast, but we figured we'd be fine. "It's just a chance of rain," one of my friends had said. "It might not even happen." We all agreed. After all, we weren't going deep into the canyon, and we could always turn back if the weather got bad. The hike started out as everything I had imagined. The walls of the canyon were impossibly high, stretching up so far that they almost seemed to close in above us. The river was cold, but not unbearable, and we carefully picked our way over the smooth, round rocks beneath the surface. Some parts were only ankle deep, while others came up to our knees. The current was steady but manageable. The deeper we went, the more beautiful it became. The way the light filtered down through the narrow opening above made the walls glow in shades of deep red and orange. Every turn in the canyon revealed something new: a waterfall cascading down from a hidden crevice, a massive boulder wedged between the walls high above, a pool of still water reflecting the sky like a mirror. We took our time, stopping often to take pictures and soak it all in. A few other hikers passed us, but for the most part, we felt like we had the place to ourselves. It was peaceful, the only sounds being the rush of the water and the occasional echo of our footsteps against the rock. We were maybe a mile from the turnaround point when the first raindrop hit the surface of the river. At first, it was just a light sprinkle, barely noticeable. But within minutes, it was coming down harder, the sound of raindrops tapping against the water growing louder. We all exchanged looks. "It's starting," someone muttered. We turned around. The hike back wouldn't be easy. The river was already rising, and we had miles to go before we were out of the canyon. At first, it didn't seem too bad. The water had risen, but it was still passable. Some of the dry spots we had walked across earlier were now submerged, but we could still see the rocky bottom. We moved quickly, no longer stopping to take in the sights. Then the current picked up. It was subtle at first, just a little stronger, pulling at our legs. But then it got worse. What had been ankle-deep water was now up to our knees, and moving faster than before. The rocks beneath our feet had become slick, making every step a struggle to keep our balance. I glanced back and saw that the rain was coming down in sheets now, blurring the walls of the canyon. The water was turning a murky brown, no longer clear. It was carrying leaves and small branches downstream, moving them faster than we were walking. That was when the fear started to creep in. We were still miles from the trailhead, and the water wasn't slowing down. If it kept rising at this rate, we were going to be in serious trouble. We picked up the pace. The river, which had been a challenge before, was now an obstacle course. The deeper sections were almost waist-high, and the current felt like it was trying to pull my feet out from under me. I had to lean forward with every step, gripping onto the larger rocks for stability. Then, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A log, thick, heavy, and moving fast, rushed past us, tumbling over the water like it weighed nothing. It disappeared around a bend, carried downstream at a speed I knew we couldn't outrun. Panic set in. If the water was strong enough to move something that big, it was strong enough to move us. I glanced at my friends. Their faces mirrored my own fear. We kept pushing forward, but the river was turning against us. Every step felt harder. The rocks underfoot were almost impossible to see. The water was rising, reaching my thighs, and I could feel the pull of the current like an invisible hand trying to drag me down. I forced myself to keep moving. Branches, sticks, even small boulders were being carried past us now. The sound of the rushing water had grown deafening, drowning out everything else. Then I stumbled. My foot slipped on a hidden rock, and before I could catch myself, the current grabbed me. For a split second, I was weightless, my feet no longer touching the ground. The water pulled me forward, and panic exploded in my chest. I thrashed, trying to grab onto something, anything, but the current was too strong. Then a hand. One of my friends grabbed my arm, yanking me back toward solid footing. My legs found the ground again, and I scrambled for balance. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. That was close. Too close. I didn't say anything. There was no time. We had to keep going. The last stretch of the hike was a blur of exhaustion and fear. The rain never let up. The water kept rising. At one point, we had to climb up onto a rock ledge to get past a section that had become completely impassable. By the time we finally saw the trailhead in the distance, I was soaked, freezing, and drained. The river behind us was now unrecognizable from the one we had started in. It was no longer a gentle stream. It was a roaring, churning force of nature. We had made it out. Later that night, as we sat in our dry clothes, still processing what had happened, I realized how close we had come to disaster. A week later, my phone buzzed with a message from one of my friends. It was a news article. A hiker had attempted the Narrows the weekend after we had. They hadn't made it out. They had gotten trapped by the rising water. And they had drowned. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. That could have been us. We had been lucky. If we had waited any longer to turn around, if we had been just a little slower, if the water had risen just a little faster. I shut my phone off. I didn't need to read the rest. I already knew how it ended. As a medical student on the cusp of completing my training to become a family doctor, I had already experienced a multitude of cases during my rotations. However, one particular weekend during my emergency room, ER, rotation would leave an indelible mark on my memory, challenging my understanding of medicine and the fragility of life. It was a typical bustling Friday evening in the ER, with a steady influx of patients presenting with various ailments and injuries. Amidst the controlled chaos, a 16-year-old male was wheeled in on a stretcher, accompanied by his anxious parents. The young man, whom I'll refer to as Alex, was a high school football player who had sustained a concussion during a game earlier that day. According to his parents, he had briefly lost consciousness on the field, but had seemed relatively fine afterward, exhibiting only mild dizziness and a slight headache. As part of the standard protocol for head injuries, Alex underwent a thorough neurological examination. His Glasgow Coma Scale, GCS, score was 14, indicating minor impairment, and he showed no signs of focal neurological deficits. A computed tomography, CT, scan of his head was performed, which revealed no acute intracranial abnormalities. Given his stable condition, Alex was admitted for observation, with plans for regular neurological assessments to monitor for any potential deterioration. Shortly after Alex's admission, the ER received another patient, a 20-year-old woman named Maria, who was approximately 8 weeks pregnant. She presented with acute abdominal pain, which she described as sharp and localized to the lower quadrants. Maria appeared pale and was visibly distressed, clutching her abdomen as she was assisted into a wheelchair by her partner. Given her pregnancy and the nature of her symptoms, there was an immediate concern for potential obstetric emergencies, such as an ectopic pregnancy or a threatened miscarriage. A transvaginal ultrasound was promptly performed, which confirmed an intrauterine pregnancy with a detectable fetal heartbeat. However, the ultrasound also revealed a significant amount of free fluid in the abdominal cavity, raising suspicions of internal bleeding. Further assessment revealed that Maria's blood pressure was dropping and her heart rate was elevated, indicative of hypovolemic shock. The decision was made to perform an emergency laparotomy to identify and control the source of the bleeding. As the clock approached midnight, signaling the end of my shift, I prepared to hand over my cases to the incoming team. Alex remained stable, resting comfortably in his observation bed, with no new symptoms reported. Maria had been transferred to the operating room, and the surgical team was preparing to commence the procedure. I briefed my colleagues on both cases, ensuring they were aware of the pertinent details and the plans in place for each patient. Leaving the hospital that night, I couldn't help but reflect on the unpredictability of medical emergencies. Two young individuals, each facing unforeseen health crises, were now under the care of our medical team. Little did I know that the events unfolding over the next 48 hours would be both tragic and perplexing, challenging our medical understanding and leaving a lasting impact on all involved. Returning to the hospital on Saturday morning for a scheduled lecture, I took the opportunity to check on the patients I had admitted the previous night. To my dismay, I learned that both cases had taken unexpected turns. Overnight, Alex's condition had worsened. He became increasingly lethargic and unresponsive to verbal stimuli. A repeat neurological examination showed a decline in his GCS score to 9, indicating a moderate to severe impairment. An urgent magnetic resonance imaging (MRI) scan was performed, which revealed diffuse cerebral edema, but no evidence of hemorrhage or ischemic stroke. The medical team was puzzled by the rapid progression of his symptoms. Despite aggressive measures to reduce intracranial pressure, including the administration of hyperosmolar therapy and intubation for airway protection, Alex's neurological status continued to decline. By Saturday evening, he had slipped into a coma, unresponsive to all stimuli. Meanwhile, Maria's surgery had revealed a ruptured ovarian cyst that had caused significant intra-abdominal bleeding. The surgical team successfully controlled the hemorrhage and transfused blood products to stabilize her hemodynamics. However, during the postoperative period, Maria developed acute respiratory distress and refractory hypotension. Despite exhaustive resuscitative efforts, she suffered a cardiac arrest and was pronounced dead in the early hours of Saturday morning. The fetus, at only 8 weeks gestation, was also lost. The sudden loss of Maria and her unborn child cast a somber mood over the entire hospital staff. Counseling services were offered to the grieving family, and a multidisciplinary meeting was scheduled to review the case in detail, aiming to understand the sequence of events that led to such a devastating outcome. On Sunday, the focus shifted to Alex's unexplained deterioration. A comprehensive panel of tests was ordered, including toxicology screens, autoimmune panels, and infectious disease workups, all of which returned negative or within normal limits. Neurology and neurosurgery consultations were sought, but no definitive cause for his rapid neurological decline could be identified. Discussions among the medical team considered rare entities, such as cerebral venous sinus thrombosis or a traumatic dissection of the cervical arteries, but imaging studies did not support these diagnoses. The lack of a clear etiology was both frustrating and disheartening, as Alex's condition continued to worsen despite all interventions. By Monday morning, Alex exhibited signs of brainstem dysfunction, including the loss of pupillary reflexes and absent corneal responses. An electroencephalogram, EEG, confirmed the absence of cortical activity. Camping always felt like an adventure when I was a kid. Being out in the woods, away from everything, no school, no homework, no rules except the ones my parents made up on the spot. It was supposed to be fun. It was supposed to be a break from normal life. But that trip was different. That trip stuck with me in a way none of the others did. We had gone to a state park, a place my dad had taken us before. It was deep in the woods, far enough that the nearest gas station was almost an hour away. No cabins, no RVs, just a tent and whatever we packed. I don't remember exactly how old I was, maybe 10, maybe 11. I just remember the feeling, the way the air felt different there, how the trees seemed to close in once the sun went down. The first night, things were normal. We set up the tent, built a fire, roasted some hot dogs, the usual stuff. But as soon as it got dark, I started hearing things. It wasn't animals, at least I didn't think so. I was used to the normal sounds of the woods, the rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig under something's feet. But this was different. It was further out, like something moving just beyond where the firelight reached. A slow, deliberate noise, like someone stepping carefully, almost sneaking. I told myself it was just my imagination. I was a kid. My brain was wired to turn shadows into monsters. I tried to ignore it, but then I saw my dad glance up from where he was sitting. He heard it too. After a while, the sound stopped, and I managed to fall asleep. But the next morning, my dad mentioned he was going to take a look around, just to see if anyone else had set up camp nearby. This was a primitive camping area. No official spots, no rangers checking in, just a dirt trail leading in and out. We hadn't seen any other cars when we arrived, and as far as we knew, we were the only ones out there. When he came back, he looked unsettled. He told my mom, quietly, like he didn't want me to hear, that he found an old, torn-up sleeping bag out in the woods, along with a bunch of empty bottles. I acted like I wasn't listening, but I heard every word. That stuck with me the whole day. The woods didn't feel the same after that. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching us from between the trees. But every time I turned around, there was nothing. Later that evening, while everyone was busy getting dinner ready, I decided to go look for myself. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't believe him. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it wasn't that bad. I followed the same path my dad had taken. The woods felt heavier the further I went, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The trees were packed tightly together, their branches hanging low, making it feel like I was being swallowed up. I heard it before I saw it. A noise, low, rough, almost like an animal grunting. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to turn back, to run, but I forced myself forward, just a little further. Then I saw it. Just like my dad said, a filthy, ripped-up sleeping bag, half covered in dirt and leaves. Around it, empty bottles were scattered like someone had been there for a long time. But no one was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was nearby, watching. I turned and ran. For the rest of the trip, I couldn't shake the feeling. Even when I was sitting by the fire, even when I was inside the tent, zipped up tight in my sleeping bag, I felt it. That feeling of being watched. That last night, I had a nightmare. In the dream, a bear came into our tent. It moved slowly, sniffing, its breath hot against my face. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then it clamped its jaws around my foot and bit down. I woke up with a jolt, heart hammering, breath caught in my throat. But the sensation didn't go away. Something was on my foot. I froze. My whole body went cold, a deep, sinking terror settling in my chest. I reached for my flashlight with shaking hands, barely able to hold onto it as I flicked it on. The beam hit something. A face. A filthy, wrinkled face, skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, eyes wide and shining in the light. A man. An old man. His mouth was wrapped around my toes. I screamed. I kicked as hard as I could, scrambling backward, my sleeping bag tangling around me. He let go, stumbling back on all fours like some kind of animal, and then he was gone. He bolted out of the tent, disappearing into the night, the sound of his footsteps fading into the trees. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there, flashlight shaking in my hand, staring at the open tent flap. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I didn't tell anyone. Not my dad. Not my mom. No one. I don't know why. Maybe I thought they wouldn't believe me. Maybe I didn't want to believe it myself. The next morning, we packed up and left. I kept looking out the window as we drove away, watching the trees blur past. I never went back to that campsite, and I never told anyone. Until now.